Have you ever considered how some conversations, thousands of years ago, echo into our present, shaping the very ground we walk on? Or perhaps wondered about the strange facts surrounding figures so monumental, their lives feel more like myth than history? For instance, did you know that the very first queen of Egypt, Merenith, held power over 3,000 years before Cleopatra? The mysteries of ancient power, of rulers whose names we still whisper, truly make you question what past really means. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And so, we begin our journey not with Cleopatra herself, but with the grand, almost absurd ambition of a man who never set foot in Egypt, yet reshaped its destiny for centuries, Alexander the Great. Imagine, if you will, a young Macedonian king sweeping across the known world like a desert wind, his armies an unstoppable force. He wasn't just conquering, he was sketching out a new global order with the tip of his sword. When he finally turned his gaze towards Egypt in 332 BCE, it wasn't a brutal conquest, but more of a liberation from Persian rule, who, let's be honest, weren't exactly winning any popularity contests in the Nile Delta. The Egyptians, weary of foreign dominion, largely welcomed him, perhaps seeing in him a less oppressive overlord. Alexander, ever the visionary, understood the strategic goldmine that Egypt represented, a fertile land, a gateway to Africa, and a breadbasket for his burgeoning empire. He established the magnificent city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, a city that would become a beacon of learning and trade, and, crucially, the future capital of his Egyptian domain. But here's the twist in this epic tale. Alexander, for all his boundless energy and strategic genius, had one glaring flaw. He didn't bother to name an heir. It's like throwing a grand party, inviting everyone, and then just leaving without telling anyone who gets to keep the house. This oversight, this almost casual disregard for succession, plunged his vast empire into a chaotic free-for-all among his generals after his untimely death in 393 BCE. Enter Ptolemy, or Soter, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, a man who had seen it all, from the dusty battlefields of Persia to the exotic wonders of India. He was a survivor, a pragmatist, and perhaps a touch opportunistic, as good generals often are. While other generals were tearing chunks out of each other's territories in a game of imperial whack-a-mole, Ptolemy, with a quiet shrewdness that belied his soldierly exterior, made a rather clever move. He secured Egypt. Think of it as calling dibs on the best piece of pizza at the party. He didn't just seize it. He slowly, deliberately consolidated his power, initially as a satrap, a governor, for Alexander's nominal successors. But as the dust settled from the wars of the Diadochi, the successor was, it became increasingly clear that no one was going to reunite Alexander's sprawling empire. So Ptolemy, seeing the writing on the papyrus, declared himself king of Egypt in 305 BCE, effectively establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty. This wasn't some minor local chieftain. This was a Hellenistic superpower, blending Greek culture, administration, and military prowess with the ancient traditions and wealth of Egypt. It was a bizarre, yet fascinating cultural fusion, like a Greek toga party suddenly being held in a pharaoh's palace. The Ptolemaic dynasty, though Greek in origin, adopted many Egyptian customs, including the rather problematic tradition of brother-sister marriage to keep the royal bloodline pure, or at least confined to a very small genetic pool. This practice, while common among Egyptian pharaohs, would lead to a truly bewildering family tree, full of power struggles, betrayals, and general sibling rivalry that makes modern reality TV look positively tame. Imagine the family dinners. "Oh, Ptolemy Tweedine, fancy seeing you here. Still trying to usurp the throne, I see." This tradition, steeped in ancient Egyptian religious beliefs about divine kingship, was embraced by the Ptolemies as a way to legitimize their rule in the eyes of their Egyptian subjects, even as they maintained their Greek identity. Historians still argue whether this practice was more about religious adherence or simply a cold, calculated strategy to concentrate power and prevent external rivals from marrying into the family. Either way, it certainly made for some awkward Christmases. This dynasty would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, a remarkably long run for any ruling family, especially one founded by a foreign general. They accumulated immense wealth, largely thanks to Egypt's fertile lands and strategic position as a trade hub between East and West. Alexandria, under their patronage, blossomed into a magnificent metropolis, boasting the famous Library of Alexandria, a veritable treasure trove of ancient knowledge, and the Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was a city of unparalleled intellectual and architectural grandeur, a true testament to the Ptolemaic vision. However, by the time we get to the final Ptolemies, the dynasty was showing its age. The early vigor and administrative genius had faded, replaced by internal squabbles, corruption, and a growing dependence on Rome, the rising power in the West. The once mighty kingdom was becoming a client state, slowly but surely being drawn into the Roman sphere of influence, much like a small boat being inexorably pulled into a powerful whirlpool. The stage was set, the ancient foundations laid, and the curtain was about to rise on the very last act of this long, strange play, featuring a queen whose name would echo through eternity. With that rather extensive family tree and the rising power of Rome firmly in mind, let's zoom in on a specific branch of that convoluted Ptolemaic lineage, to a time when the dynasty, though still fabulously wealthy, was definitely past its prime. It was into this world of fading glory and intense familial backstabbing that Cleopatra VII Philopator arrived, probably in late 69 BC. We don't know her exact birth date, which is a bit of a historical bummer, but it gives us an excuse to imagine a grand, possibly overly dramatic, entrance. Her father was Ptolemy Sthungd Aulitz, often rather unflatteringly nicknamed the flute player or the bastard. Historians still argue whether this moniker was a genuine reference to his alleged love of music or a thinly veiled insult regarding his questionable legitimacy and unkingly behavior. Either way, it hardly screams powerful, revered monarch. Ptolemy XIV was, to put it mildly, not a strong ruler. He was heavily reliant on Rome for support, having literally bought his throne back after being exiled, which meant Egypt was increasingly acting as Rome's ATM rather than an independent kingdom. Cleopatra's early life, then, was probably spent in the opulent but incredibly dangerous confines of the royal palace in Alexandria. Imagine growing up in a place where your closest relatives were often your most deadly rivals. Every whispered conversation, every shadow, could conceal a plot. It was less a childhood and more a live-action game of thrones, with real crowns and real consequences. She was not the only child. She had an older sister, Berenice IV, who would briefly usurp their father's throne, and two younger sisters, Arsinoe the Foam and Cleopatra Tryphena, though some sources merge the latter two, and two younger brothers, both named Ptolemy. Yes, seriously, two brothers named Ptolemy. Because why make it easy? This multitude of siblings, all with a claim to the throne, guaranteed a perpetual state of tension. It's enough to make you wish for a quiet suburban life, isn't it? Despite the constant political turmoil, Cleopatra received an extraordinary education, befitting a Ptolemaic princess. Unlike many of her predecessors, who clung fiercely to their Greek heritage and barely bothered with Egyptian, Cleopatra was fluent in multiple languages, a remarkable feat for her time. She reportedly spoke Egyptian, Greek, of course, Aramaic, Hebrew, Ethiopian, and even the language of the Medes and Parthians. Imagine the kind of brain power that takes. This linguistic prowess wasn't just a party trick. It was a powerful political tool. It allowed her to communicate directly with her subjects, her foreign ambassadors, and crucially, with the diverse peoples within her own empire. It set her apart from her Ptolemaic ancestors, many of whom didn't even bother to learn Egyptian, preferring to rule through Greek intermediaries. Historians still argue whether her proficiency in Egyptian was a genuine cultural affinity or a pragmatic political calculation to gain popular support. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a blend of necessity and genuine intellectual curiosity. This intellectual curiosity extended beyond languages. She was deeply interested in mathematics, philosophy, literature, and astronomy. She wasn't just a pretty face. She was a sharp, calculating mind, honed by years of observation and intense study. Her childhood was also shaped by Alexandria itself, a city that truly lived up to its name as a center of learning and culture. The Library of Alexandria, though already past its zenith, was still an unparalleled repository of knowledge. The Mauseon, a kind of ancient research institute, buzzed with scholars and thinkers. Cleopatra would have been exposed to the latest scientific theories, philosophical debates, and literary works of the Hellenistic world. It was a cosmopolitan melting pot, a place where different cultures intersected and sometimes clashed. This environment, while intellectually stimulating, also presented a constant reminder of Egypt's increasingly precarious position. Roman merchants and officials were a common sight, their presence a subtle but undeniable sign of Rome's growing influence. The whispers of Roman power, the occasional legions passing through, would have been an ever-present backdrop to her formative years. We often imagine Cleopatra as this fully formed, seductive queen from the moment she appears on the historical stage. But her childhood was likely one of rigorous study, political maneuvering, and a keen awareness of the fragile nature of power. She learned early on that the throne was not a given, but something to be fought for, protected, and, if necessary, reclaimed. Her father's constant struggle to maintain his position, his desperate trips to Rome to beg for support and money, would have been a harsh lesson in the realities of international politics. She saw firsthand how easily power could slip away, how fickle alliances could be, and how utterly dependent Egypt had become on the whims of a distant, more powerful republic. This upbringing, far from being sheltered, forged a keen political intellect and an unshakable determination. She wasn't just learning history, she was living it, preparing for a future where she would have to navigate the treacherous currents of a world dominated by Rome. The little girl who would become queen was already learning the ruthless dance of diplomacy and survival. So, imagine a young woman, not yet 20, steeped in ancient knowledge and brutal political realities, suddenly thrust onto the grand, precarious stage of power. In 51 BCE, after years of trying to appease Rome and keep his shaky throne, Ptolemy thought. Auletes finally shuffled off this mortal coil, leaving behind a kingdom deeply in debt and a family rife with ambition. His will, a rather desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of order, stipulated that his eldest surviving daughter, Cleopatra, would rule jointly with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy III. Yes, you heard that right, a 10-year-old. This co-regency was less a partnership and more a ticking time bomb. The idea was to keep the dynasty going, but the reality was that it created an immediate power vacuum. A vacuum that multiple factions would try to fill. Cleopatra, at around 18 or 19, was certainly not a typical teenage queen. She was formidable, intelligent, and unlike her immediate predecessors, she understood the immense power of public perception and political leverage. From the outset, she began asserting her authority, making decisions that went against the entrenched Greek court officials who preferred to pull the strings behind the scenes. This wasn't just a simple disagreement. This was a fundamental clash over who would truly govern Egypt. These powerful eunuchs and advisors, chief among them Pothinus, Ptolemy III's tutor and regent, and Achillas, the commander of the army, saw Cleopatra as a threat to their own influence. They preferred a malleable child king they could easily manipulate, rather than a sharp, ambitious queen who had her own ideas. Historians still argue whether Pothinus genuinely believed he was acting in Egypt's best interest by opposing Cleopatra, or if he was simply a power-hungry manipulator. Given the cutthroat nature of Ptolemaic politics, it was probably a generous mix of both. One of Cleopatra's early acts that particularly ruffled feathers was her bold move to mint coins with her sole image, a clear declaration of her intent to rule without impediment. This might seem like a small detail to us, but in the ancient world, coinage was a powerful medium for propaganda, broadcasting the ruler's authority far and wide. It was a subtle, yet unmistakable signal that she wasn't going to be a puppet queen. She also began to appear in official documents as simply Cleopatra, dropping the joint Ptolemy title that was customary for co-rulers, another deliberate statement of her individual sovereignty. These acts, though seemingly minor, were radical departures from tradition and clear challenges to the established order. The tension between Cleopatra and the court faction, ostensibly ruling in Ptolemy III's name, escalated quickly. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. By 49 BCE, just 2 years into her reign, the friction became an open conflict. Pothinus and Achillas, sensing Cleopatra's growing power and popularity among the Egyptian populace, orchestrated a coup. They systematically stripped her of her authority and eventually forced her to flee Alexandria. Imagine, if you will, being queen one day, then literally running for your life the next, sneaking out of your own palace, perhaps under the cover of darkness, with only a handful of loyalists. It's the kind of dramatic exit that modern thrillers are made of. She wasn't just exiled. She was effectively declared an enemy of the state, a dangerous outcast. Cleopatra didn't just vanish into the desert. She fled to Syria, specifically to the Roman province there, demonstrating her understanding of where true power lay in the region. She didn't go meekly. She went with a plan. Her objective was clear: raise an army, rally support, and reclaim her rightful throne. She understood that appealing to the Roman authorities, the ultimate arbiters of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, was her best bet. This was a desperate gamble, but Cleopatra was never one to back down from a fight. It's hard not to admire that kind of grit, even if it led to some rather sticky situations. Her younger sister, Arsinoe IV, also fled the capital around this time, but her motives and allegiances remain murky. Was she fleeing with Cleopatra, or was she simply escaping the chaos? Historians are still sifting through the limited evidence, trying to piece together the full story. While Cleopatra was busy gathering her forces on Egypt's eastern border, her younger brother, or rather, the faction ruling in his name, continued to solidify their control over Alexandria. They were effectively running the show, purging Cleopatra's supporters and reinforcing their own positions. But this fragile peace was about to be shattered by an external force, a force so immense that it would completely reorient the political landscape of the entire Mediterranean world, Rome. More specifically, the arrival of Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, the celebrated Roman general, who was fleeing his arch-rival Julius Caesar after the decisive Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey, seeking refuge and assistance, sailed to Egypt, believing he would find a safe haven with a friendly client kingdom. Oh, how wrong he was. The stage was now perfectly set for an epic collision. Cleopatra, with her newly assembled army, was poised to invade Egypt from the east. Her brother's faction, comfortable but perhaps too complacent in Alexandria, controlled the heart of the kingdom. And then, like a plot twist straight out of a particularly dramatic opera, the most powerful Roman of his age, Julius Caesar, was about to arrive, hot on Pompey's heels. The Ptolemaic court, in a move that would prove catastrophically short-sighted, decided to make a pragmatic choice. They assassinated Pompey, hoping to curry favor with the victorious Caesar. They presented his severed head to Caesar upon his arrival, a truly horrific welcome to Egypt gift. Little did they know, Caesar, for all his ruthlessness, valued old alliances and the traditions of Roman power. This act, far from endearing them to Caesar, utterly appalled him, and with Caesar now on Egyptian soil, the fate of Cleopatra, her brother, and indeed all of Egypt, hung precariously in the balance. The game, as they say, was well and truly afoot. Imagine this incredibly tense scene. Cleopatra, having fled Alexandria, is busy raising an army on Egypt's eastern frontier, ready to fight her way back to the throne. Meanwhile, in the bustling, treacherous city of Alexandria, her young brother, Ptolemy III, or rather the ruthless eunuch Pothinus and General Achillas, who controlled him, are feeling rather smug about having expelled the troublesome queen. But then, as we discussed, Pompey the Great, Caesar's defeated rival, arrives seeking sanctuary, only to be brutally murdered on their orders. This act, meant to ingratiate them with Caesar, instead sets the stage for a truly cinematic entrance. The political climate of the Mediterranean at this point was akin to a pressure cooker, and Egypt was about to become the principal ingredient. And then Julius Caesar himself arrived in Alexandria, hot on Pompey's trail, expecting to capture his rival. What he found instead was a severed head presented on a platter, a gruesome, audacious gift from Ptolemy III's court. Caesar, a man known for his cold pragmatism, but also for a certain Roman decorum, was reportedly appalled by this act. It wasn't just the brutality. It was the violation of hospitality, the disrespect shown to a former consul of Rome, even one he had just defeated. This move by Pothinus and Achilles was a monumental miscalculation, one that would backfire spectacularly. Caesar, far from being pleased, was deeply offended. He landed in Alexandria with a surprisingly small force, perhaps just a few thousand men, intending to settle the ongoing civil war between Cleopatra and her brother, and more importantly, to collect the vast debts owed to Rome by the Ptolemaic kingdom. After all, the Ptolemies owed a considerable amount of denarii, and Caesar was never one to forget a debt. Cleopatra, ever the shrewd strategist, understood that Caesar's presence was a game changer. She knew she couldn't rely solely on military force to reclaim her throne. She needed Caesar's backing. But how to get to him? Past her brother's watchful guards in Alexandria. This is where the story takes a turn into legendary territory. A tale so bold, it almost defies belief. The well-known account, popularized by ancient historians like Plutarch, describes her being smuggled into the palace, possibly rolled up in a carpet or a laundry sack. Imagine the scene. A general, the most powerful man in the Roman world, expecting a formal delegation. And instead, a beautiful, determined young queen literally unrolls herself before him. Historians still argue whether the carpet story is literal truth or a dramatic embellishment designed to highlight her daring and ingenuity. Either way, the essence of the story remains. She found a way to bypass her enemies and gain direct access to Caesar, charming him with her intellect and resolve. It's hard not to chuckle at the thought of a Roman legionary being tasked with carrying a laundry sack that felt surprisingly heavy and perhaps fragrant. This secret meeting, occurring in late 48 BCE, was the turning point. Cleopatra, unlike her brother's crude approach, appealed to Caesar's sense of justice and his pragmatic desire for a stable, pro-Roman ruler in Egypt. She presented her case eloquently, portraying herself as the rightful heir, unjustly deposed by ambitious courtiers. Her intelligence, her charm, and her ability to speak directly to Caesar in Greek, a language he admired and often used himself, undoubtedly made a powerful impression. Caesar, never one to miss an opportunity, quickly realized that Cleopatra was a far more intelligent and capable ruler than her young, easily manipulated brother. He saw in her not just a queen, but a potential ally who could secure Egypt's immense wealth and resources for Rome and for himself. The immediate consequence of this clandestine meeting was a dramatic shift in Caesar's policy. He declared that he would uphold Ptolemy III's will, meaning Cleopatra and Ptolemy III should indeed rule jointly. This seemingly impartial ruling infuriated Pothinus and Achilles, who had gambled everything on Caesar siding with them. They saw Cleopatra's influence over Caesar as an existential threat to their power. The situation quickly spiraled into open warfare, not just between the rival Ptolemaic factions, but now with the Roman legions caught in the middle. This conflict, known as the Alexandrian War, was unexpected and brutal. Caesar, with his relatively small force, found himself besieged in the palace district of Alexandria, fighting for his life against the much larger Egyptian army loyal to Ptolemy III. It was a perilous situation, a true testament to Caesar's audacious personality to walk into such a hornet's nest with so few men. During this intense siege, the famous library of Alexandria suffered a catastrophic fire. Historians still argue about the extent of the damage, but it's widely believed that a significant portion of its irreplaceable scrolls and texts were lost. A truly tragic blow to ancient knowledge. Whether it was an accidental casualty of war or a deliberate act, the burning of the library remains one of history's great intellectual tragedies. Amidst the chaos and fighting, Cleopatra remained by Caesar's side, sharing the dangers and undoubtedly offering counsel. Her commitment during this perilous time would have further cemented her bond with the Roman general. The stakes were incredibly high. If Caesar fell, so too would her hopes of regaining the throne. It was a dangerous alliance, but for Cleopatra, it was the only path forward. Her life, her throne, and the future of Egypt now hinged entirely on the fortunes of this extraordinary Roman general. So there we are, in the thick of the Alexandrian War, with Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome, effectively trapped in the royal palace district of Alexandria, fighting for his life alongside Cleopatra against the overwhelming forces loyal to her brother, Ptolemy. It's a situation fraught with danger, a siege that dragged on for months, testing Caesar's legendary military acumen and Cleopatra's steadfast resolve. This wasn't some quick skirmish. It was a desperate struggle for survival, a high-stakes gamble where the fate of Egypt, and indeed a significant chunk of the Roman Republic's future, hung in the balance. Imagine the tension, the sounds of battle echoing through the marble halls, the constant threat of being overrun. It certainly wasn't the leisurely vacation Caesar might have envisioned after chasing Pompey across half the known world. The Egyptian forces, led by the shrewd but ultimately ill-fated Pothinus and the army commander Achilles, had the advantage of numbers and familiarity with the city. They controlled the crucial waterways and the land routes, effectively cutting off Caesar's escape. But Caesar was, well, Caesar. He was a master of improvisation and calculated risks. He fortified his position, launched daring counterattacks, and even took control of the pharaoh's lighthouse to secure the harbor, a move that effectively cut off Egyptian naval access. During this time, Cleopatra was not merely a passive bystander. She was by Caesar's side, a political advisor and a symbol of the legitimate Ptolemaic claim, bolstering his position among those Egyptians who still harbored loyalties to the true line of pharaohs. Historians still argue about the exact extent of her tactical involvement, but it's clear she wasn't just sitting idly by, filing her nails. She would have provided invaluable intelligence about the local terrain, the political factions, and the strengths and weaknesses of her brother's forces. A particularly dramatic episode during this war involved Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe IV. Remember her? She had fled Alexandria earlier, and now, rather opportunistically, she joined the forces opposing Caesar and Cleopatra. Arsinoe was even proclaimed queen by a faction of the Egyptian army, essentially creating a third claimant to the throne and further complicating an already chaotic situation. She was, by all accounts, as ambitious and cunning as her older sister, perhaps even more ruthless. This sibling rivalry wasn't just a squabble over who got the biggest slice of the cake. It was a brutal fight for absolute power, where family ties meant absolutely nothing. Arsinoe even managed to get Achilles, the general loyal to her brother, assassinated, placing her own general, Ganymedes, in command. Talk about cutting out the middleman. This internal strife within the Egyptian forces, however, ultimately weakened their coordinated efforts against Caesar, ironically playing into his hands. The turning point finally came with the arrival of Roman reinforcements. Caesar, having sent urgent pleas for help, was eventually joined by legions from Syria, led by Mithridates of Pergamon. This fresh influx of seasoned Roman soldiers was exactly what Caesar needed to break the stalemate. With the additional troops, Caesar was able to launch a decisive offensive. The final climactic battle took place near the Nile Delta in the spring of 47 BCE. Ptolemy III, leading his forces, attempted to cross a branch of the Nile River, possibly to escape or to reposition his troops. But his boat capsized, and the young king, still a mere teenager, drowned. His death, whether by accident or by the weight of his golden armor, as some accounts suggest, effectively ended the Alexandrian War. It was an ignominious end for a boy king who had been little more than a pawn in the hands of ambitious courtiers. You'd think, after all that, someone would remember to pack a life vest, wouldn't you? With Ptolemy III dead and Arsinoe captured, Caesar was finally in a position to dictate terms. He installed Cleopatra as the undisputed ruler of Egypt, but not without a catch. As per her father's will, she was to rule alongside another one of her younger brothers, Ptolemy XIX, who was even younger than Ptolemy III had been, perhaps only 12 years old. This was a clear move by Caesar to ensure a compliant and stable client ruler in Egypt. A young, easily influenced co-ruler was far less of a threat than an ambitious and independent queen, even one he admired. This also meant that Caesar avoided the appearance of direct Roman annexation, which could have stirred up unwanted resentment and rebellions. Egypt remained technically independent, but its independence was clearly underwritten by Roman power. The Alexandrian War had been a harsh lesson for all involved. For Cleopatra, it solidified her rule, but also cemented her dependence on Rome. For Caesar, it was a dangerous detour that nearly cost him his life, but ultimately secured a vital source of wealth and grain for Rome. And for Egypt, it marked the beginning of its final chapter as an independent kingdom, now firmly ensnared in the vast, ever-expanding web of Roman influence. The foundation of Cleopatra's reign was now established, but it was a foundation built on Roman swords and Roman political machinations. The stage was now truly set for the next, equally dramatic act in her life, her relationship with Caesar, and the profound changes it would bring. With the Alexandrian War finally concluded and the political landscape of Egypt seemingly settled by Caesar's decree, Cleopatra found herself at the zenith of her power within Egypt, though keenly aware that this power was inextricably linked to Roman might. Her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, was merely a figurehead, a boy king existing solely to fulfill the terms of their father's will and appease Roman sensibilities about co-regency. Cleopatra, now the undisputed senior ruler, wasted no time consolidating her authority. She was not content to merely sit on the throne. She aimed to restore the Ptolemaic dynasty to some semblance of its former glory, or at least ensure its survival in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. This wasn't just about personal ambition. It was about the survival of her ancient kingdom. But amidst the political maneuvering and the arduous task of rebuilding Egypt after a civil war, a more personal and ultimately world-changing development was unfolding. The relationship between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar had deepened considerably during the months of the Alexandrian War. Sharing danger, making life or death decisions together, and enduring the siege undoubtedly forged a powerful bond. Caesar, a man of immense intellect and formidable charm himself, was clearly captivated by Cleopatra's intelligence, her charisma, and her unusual ability to engage with him on an equal intellectual footing. This was no mere dalliance with a foreign queen. This was a meeting of two of the most powerful and extraordinary minds of their age. She was certainly beautiful, as ancient sources attest, but it was her sharp wit, her multilingualism, and her regal bearing that truly captivated the Roman general. Historians still argue whether their relationship was primarily a calculated political alliance or a genuine, passionate love affair. But it's likely a complex mixture of both. After all, when you're dealing with people who literally control empires, it's rarely simple. It was during this period, likely in June 47th BCE, that Cleopatra gave birth to a son. This child, born of the union between the Queen of Egypt and the dictator of Rome, was named Ptolemy Caesar, though he would become universally known by his diminutive and perhaps more affectionate nickname, Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. The birth of Caesarion was an event of monumental significance. For Cleopatra, it represented the ultimate legitimization of her rule and a potential dynastic successor who combined the bloodlines of two powerful empires. It was a potent symbol of her connection to the most powerful man in the world, a living testament to her influence. For Caesar, however, the implications were far more complex and politically perilous. While Cleopatra openly acknowledged Caesarion as Caesar's son, Caesar himself never formally did so. In Roman society, acknowledging an illegitimate child was tricky, especially for a man of Caesar's standing who already had an adopted heir, his great-nephew Octavian. To formally acknowledge Caesarion would have meant declaring him a legitimate heir, potentially upsetting the delicate balance of Roman politics and risking accusations of attempting to establish a monarchy, a concept anathema to the Roman Republic. It's the ancient world's version of a paternity test, but with way higher stakes and no daytime TV drama. Yet, Caesar did allow Cleopatra to name the child Caesar, a subtle but undeniable nod to his paternity. He also spent several more months in Egypt after the war, enjoying a prolonged vacation with Cleopatra, touring the Nile, and engaging in discussions with Egyptian priests and scholars. This extended stay, unusual for a Roman general who had a republic to run, certainly spoke volumes about his feelings for the Egyptian queen. During this post-war period, Caesar helped Cleopatra solidify her rule, offering advice on administration and even supporting some of her domestic policies. He recognized the strategic importance of a stable, friendly Egypt to Rome, especially given its vast grain supplies, which were crucial for feeding Rome's burgeoning population. Cleopatra, in turn, demonstrated her loyalty to Caesar and her understanding of Roman power dynamics. She undoubtedly showed him the wealth and grandeur of her kingdom, reinforcing the idea of Egypt as a valuable ally rather than a conquered province. This alliance, cemented by their personal relationship and the birth of Caesarion, formed a powerful bloc in the Mediterranean. However, the longer Caesar stayed in Egypt, the more murmurs began to spread in Rome. His legions were becoming restless, and the political situation back home, though under his firm control, required his presence. After what was effectively an extended honeymoon, Caesar finally departed Egypt in the summer of 47 BCE, leaving Cleopatra firmly in charge, with Caesarion by her side. He left behind 3 legions, supposedly to protect Cleopatra and secure Roman interests, but also as a not-so-subtle reminder of Roman authority. Their parting was not the end of their story, however. Caesar would eventually invite Cleopatra to Rome. The birth of Caesarion marked a pivotal moment, not just for Cleopatra personally, but for the entire Ptolemaic dynasty. It represented a bold attempt to secure the dynasty's future by intertwining it with the destiny of Rome's most powerful figure. For a queen who had just fought to reclaim her throne, the birth of a son by Julius Caesar was the ultimate statement of her power and her vision for a revitalized Egypt. Little did they know, this child, this little Caesar, would become a pawn in a far greater game. His existence, a threat to some, a symbol of hope to others, and ultimately, a tragic figure caught in the relentless march of history. His arrival on the scene set the stage for Cleopatra's grand but ultimately perilous journey to Rome, a journey that would forever link her name with the very heart of the Roman Republic. With Caesarion, her precious little Caesar, now several months old, and her position as the undisputed ruler of Egypt seemingly secure, Cleopatra embarked on the boldest move of her life outside her own kingdom, a visit to Rome. Imagine the audacity of it. A foreign queen, still relatively young, arriving in the very heart of the Republic that had, for centuries, looked down upon monarchs with suspicion and often contempt. This wasn't just a social call. It was a carefully calculated political maneuver, a grand entrance designed to solidify her alliance with Caesar and project her power on the world stage. Historians still argue whether her motivations were purely political, or if there was a genuine desire to be near the man who was now the father of her child. Perhaps it was a delightful blend of both, a delicious cocktail of ambition and affection. Caesar, meanwhile, had returned to Rome a triumphant victor, having quelled various revolts and cemented his position as dictator for life. He was at the absolute pinnacle of his power, virtually untouchable. It was he who extended the invitation to Cleopatra, a testament to the depth of their relationship and his recognition of Egypt's strategic importance. He even had a villa prepared for her and her retinue across the Tiber River on the Janiculum Hill, a rather swanky address overlooking the bustling city. Imagine the Roman elite, ever gossiping, ever judgmental, watching this exotic procession arrive. Cleopatra arrived with her brother husband, the young Ptolemy XIII, and, crucially, her infant son Caesarion, along with a magnificent retinue of Egyptian officials, servants, and treasures. This wasn't just a queen. This was a spectacle, an embassy designed to impress and perhaps subtly intimidate. Her presence in Rome caused an immediate sensation. The city had never seen anything quite like her. Accustomed to their austere Roman matrons, the Romans were fascinated and perhaps a little scandalized by Cleopatra's opulent lifestyle and regal bearing. She wore exotic silks and jewels. Her attendants spoke a cacophony of foreign tongues, and her very presence exuded the ancient mystery and wealth of Egypt. She captivated the Roman populace, who flocked to catch a glimpse of the legendary queen. Imagine the buzz in the forum, the whispered conversations about her beauty, her intelligence, and her undeniable influence over their beloved general. Have you seen her? She truly is a vision. Yes, but they say she even speaks Latin, utterly unheard of. These were the kinds of whispers that would have filled the air. Caesar, in a move that further fueled the gossip and the political anxieties, treated Cleopatra not merely as an allied monarch, but almost as an equal. He set up a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix, his patron goddess, right next to the goddess's own image. This was an unprecedented honor, an almost blasphemous gesture to some traditional Romans, and a clear signal of his personal devotion and her elevated status. It was akin to putting your girlfriend's portrait in your family's trophy room, but on a much grander and more politically charged scale. This act, more than any other, enraged many senators and traditionalists who saw it as further proof of Caesar's monarchical ambitions and his blatant disregard for republican norms. For them, Cleopatra represented everything Rome had fought against: foreign influence, autocracy, and effeminate luxury. Cleopatra's time in Rome lasted for nearly 2 years, from late 46 BCE to early 44 BCE. During this period, she hosted lavish dinners, engaged in intellectual discussions with Roman philosophers and scholars. She reportedly impressed Cicero with her intellect, though he later expressed disdain for her, and effectively became a visible and undeniable part of Caesar's court. Caesarion was seen by many as living proof of their relationship, a constant, tangible reminder of their bond. While Caesar never formally acknowledged him as his heir in Rome, the child's striking resemblance to his father was reportedly a topic of much discussion, making official denial a bit of a stretch. This public display of their family unit, however unconventional by Roman standards, further cemented Cleopatra's position as Caesar's paramount foreign ally and intimate companion. Her stay in Rome was, however, not without its detractors. Many influential Romans, particularly those who feared Caesar's growing power and perceived monarchical tendencies, viewed Cleopatra with suspicion and hostility. They saw her as a foreign temptress, a dangerous Eastern queen who was corrupting their revered leader and undermining the very foundations of the Republic. This sentiment was not just political. It had strong cultural and moral undertones. Roman traditionalists valued austerity and civic virtue, and Cleopatra's lavish lifestyle and unapologetic pursuit of power grated against their sensibilities. The whispers of Eastern decadence began to circulate, laying the groundwork for future propaganda campaigns against her. Historians still argue about the precise impact of her presence on Roman public opinion, but it's clear that she was a deeply polarizing figure. Despite the growing animosity from certain quarters, Cleopatra's influence over Caesar was undeniable. She experienced Roman society firsthand, observed its political machinations, and undoubtedly learned invaluable lessons about the Roman mindset. She saw the immense power of the Senate, the volatile nature of the Roman mob, and the cutthroat ambition that permeated every aspect of Roman political life. These observations would prove crucial in her future dealings with Rome. Her time in Rome was a masterclass in Roman politics, and she was a very attentive student. Little did she know, however, that this period of unparalleled influence and seemingly unshakable alliance was about to come to a sudden, violent end. The storm clouds of conspiracy were gathering, and the very foundations of the Roman Republic were about to be rocked to their core. And so, after nearly 2 years of captivating and scandalizing Rome, of living a life of unprecedented luxury and influence at Caesar's side, the world as Cleopatra knew it was about to be irrevocably shattered. The date was March 15th, 44 BCE, a day forever etched in history as the Ides of March. On this seemingly ordinary spring day, Julius Caesar, the man who had been Cleopatra's lover, the father of her child, and the bedrock of her reign, was assassinated in a brutal act of political violence. He was stabbed multiple times by a group of senators who feared his growing power and perceived monarchical ambitions, famously collapsing at the foot of Pompey's statue. It was a shocking, violent end to a man who had reshaped the Roman world, and it sent shockwaves across the entire Mediterranean. Imagine the disbelief, the horror, and the sheer chaos that erupted in Rome. Cleopatra, still residing in her villa across the Tiber, would have been immediately aware of the seismic shift. The news would have spread like wildfire, a terrifying whisper turning into a deafening roar. Her protector, her patron, the man who held her kingdom's fate in his hands, was gone. Suddenly, her carefully constructed world of influence and security crumbled. Her position in Rome, once unassailable under Caesar's wing, became instantly precarious. She was a foreign queen, the mother of Caesar's illegitimate son, in a city now plunged into uncertainty and paranoia. The very same senators who had resented her presence and despised Caesar were now in a position of power, and her vulnerability would have been palpable. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a devastating political catastrophe for her. The immediate aftermath in Rome was pure pandemonium. The conspirators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus believed they were restoring the Republic, but instead they unleashed a fresh wave of civil war and instability. The Roman people, initially stunned, soon turned against the assassins, fueled by the powerful oratory of Caesar's loyal lieutenant, Marc Antony, and the terms of Caesar's will, which generously provided for the Roman populace. The Republic, far from being restored, descended into an even deeper abyss of power struggles and political maneuvering. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, understood that staying in Rome was no longer tenable. It was too dangerous, too unpredictable, and her presence, now without Caesar's protection, was a liability. Her first priority would have been the safety of her son, Caesarion. As Caesar's only biological son, even if unacknowledged in Rome, Caesarion represented a potential threat to anyone vying for Caesar's legacy. He was a living symbol of Caesar's dictatorship for life and the very monarchical tendencies that the assassins claimed to oppose. His very existence was an inconvenient truth for Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, who was now thrust into the spotlight as Caesar's primary political successor. Cleopatra, recognizing the immense danger, made the swift and sensible decision to return to Egypt. It was a retreat, yes, but a strategic one. She left Rome around April 44th BCE, just weeks after Caesar's assassination. The journey back would have been fraught with anxiety. She had arrived in Rome as Caesar's honored guest, a queen surrounded by his protection and admiration. She left as a vulnerable monarch fleeing a city in chaos, her future uncertain, and her primary shield gone. She probably traveled with a reduced retinue, making her way back to the relative safety and familiarity of Alexandria. The Egyptian coffers were no doubt lighter after her Roman sojourn, but she returned with invaluable experience and, crucially, her son. Upon her return to Egypt, Cleopatra faced a new set of challenges. Her brother husband, Ptolemy IX, who had been a compliant figurehead, died shortly after her return, perhaps around the same time she arrived back in Alexandria. The circumstances of his death are shrouded in mystery, with many ancient sources attributing it to poison, hinting at Cleopatra's involvement. Historians still argue whether his death was a convenient illness or a deliberate act by Cleopatra to remove her last remaining co-ruler and consolidate her power entirely, ensuring Caesarion's direct succession. Given her track record and the ruthless nature of Ptolemaic politics, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that she hastened his departure. With Ptolemy IX gone, Cleopatra promptly elevated Caesarion to co-ruler, officially making him Ptolemy the Defiant Caesarion, pharaoh of Egypt, alongside his mother. This move was a clear statement. Caesarion was her legitimate heir, and the future of Egypt lay with him. It was a bold declaration, especially considering the political turmoil in Rome. Cleopatra now had to navigate a dramatically altered geopolitical landscape. The Roman Republic was tearing itself apart, and various powerful figures, Marc Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, were vying for control, forming shifting alliances, and preparing for yet another round of civil war. Egypt, with its vast grain reserves and immense wealth, was a prize that all factions would covet. Cleopatra's strategy had to shift from leveraging her personal relationship with a single dominant figure to playing a delicate game of diplomacy with multiple, often hostile, Roman powers. Her survival, and that of her kingdom, now depended on her ability to anticipate the moves of these new Roman strongmen and align herself with the winning side. The comfortable intimacy of her Roman sojourn was over. The era of ruthless survival had begun anew. With Caesar gone and Rome plunged into yet another civil war, Cleopatra found herself back in Alexandria, no longer Caesar's influential guest, but a lone queen on a very precarious throne. The comfortable stability her relationship with Caesar had provided was gone, replaced by a bewildering array of Roman factions, all vying for power. Her immediate priority was to consolidate her position in Egypt and protect her son, Caesarion, now officially Ptolemy Thentient Caesarion, from the turbulent winds blowing from Rome. This meant ensuring domestic tranquility, and perhaps more importantly, carefully observing the chaotic Roman political landscape. It was like trying to predict the path of a dozen different hurricanes all at once. Back in Rome, the political situation was a swirling vortex of alliances and betrayals. The vacuum left by Caesar's assassination was quickly being filled by three main contenders. First, there was Marc Antony, Caesar's loyal and charismatic lieutenant. Antony, a formidable general and a brilliant orator, quickly emerged as a powerful force, capitalizing on the public's outrage over Caesar's murder and his own personal popularity among the legions. He was the quintessential Roman strongman, a man of action and ambition. Then there was Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and great-nephew. A young man barely 18, Octavian initially seemed underestimated, but he possessed a cold, calculating intellect, a ruthless ambition, and a keen understanding of Roman politics. He was the quiet storm, the one you didn't see coming. And finally, there was Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a less prominent but still powerful general and Caesar's master of horse, effectively his second in command. Lepidus was a somewhat more cautious figure, often acting as a mediator between the two more dominant personalities. These three men, initially at odds, eventually realized that their individual ambitions would likely lead to mutual destruction. In 43 BCE, they formally allied, forming the Second Triumvirate. This was not merely an informal agreement. It was a legally sanctioned political alliance, given extraordinary powers by the Roman Senate to restore the Republic. Oh, the irony! Their stated goal was to hunt down and punish Caesar's assassins and their allies, most notably Brutus and Cassius, who had fled to the east, gathering their own forces. This triumvirate, unlike the informal first one, effectively carved up the Roman world among themselves. Antony took charge of the eastern provinces, including Egypt's sphere of influence. Octavian controlled the west, including Italy itself. Lepidus was granted Africa and some parts of Hispania, though his power would gradually wane. For Cleopatra, the formation of the Triumvirate was a critical development. It meant that Egypt, located strategically in the east, would fall under Antony's direct purview. She had dealt with Antony before, during Caesar's time, and knew him to be a capable, if somewhat volatile, Roman. Her immediate concern was to avoid taking sides too overtly in the escalating Roman civil war. While she had been Caesar's staunch ally, her priority was the preservation of her kingdom. She played a careful game, offering subtle support to Caesar's avengers, but always with an eye towards not alienating the Republicans, Brutus and Cassius, who controlled significant forces in the East. Historians still argue about the precise level of her engagement during this phase, but it's clear she walked a very fine line, balancing aid with neutrality. When Brutus and Cassius, needing funds and supplies for their war against the Triumvirs, demanded tribute and assistance from Egypt, Cleopatra responded cautiously. She sent a small naval squadron, feigning a storm and damaged ships as an excuse for their limited contribution. It was a clever diplomatic maneuver, designed to avoid overtly supporting Caesar's assassins, while still appearing to comply enough to avoid their wrath. She played both sides, however subtly, trying to gauge who would emerge victorious. This required immense diplomatic skill and a cold assessment of risk. Ultimately, the clash between the Triumvirs and the Republican forces culminated in the decisive battles of Philippi in 42 BCE, fought in Macedonia. This was a brutal two-part engagement that saw the forces of Antony and Octavian utterly crush the armies of Brutus and Cassius. Both Brutus and Cassius committed suicide rather than face capture, effectively ending the Republican cause and cementing the power of the Triumvirate. It was a moment of immense relief for Cleopatra. Caesar's assassins were defeated, and the path was cleared for her to openly align with the victorious party. The dice had been cast, and she had, mostly, bet on the winning side. With the defeat of the Republicans, Antony, as the architect of the victory in the East, became the undisputed master of Rome's eastern provinces. His task was monumental: to restore order, collect taxes, punish remaining enemies, and raise funds for the Triumvirate's ongoing ambitions. This meant a sweeping tour of the eastern kingdoms and client states, demanding loyalty and resources. And among those states, the wealthiest and most strategically vital was, of course, Egypt, ruled by Queen Cleopatra. The stage was now set for the most famous and ultimately tragic love affair of the ancient world. Cleopatra, having survived the immediate aftermath of Caesar's death, was about to meet the next defining figure of her life, a man whose ambition and charisma would rival her own, and whose destiny would become inextricably entwined with hers. The dust had barely settled from the decisive battles of Philippi, and with Caesar's assassins vanquished, Marc Antony emerged as the undisputed lord of Rome's eastern territories. His mission: to reorganize the sprawling, complex mosaic of client kingdoms, impose taxes, raise legions, and generally bring order to a region that had been unsettled by years of Roman civil war. This wasn't a leisurely administrative tour. It was a grand display of Roman power, a consolidation of authority that would either secure the East for the Triumvirate or plunge it into further chaos. And among the various rulers summoned to meet the powerful Roman triumvir, none was more anticipated, or indeed more important, than Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. The summons arrived in late 41 BCE, ordering Cleopatra to meet Antony in the city of Tarsus, located in Cilicia, modern-day Turkey. This wasn't a request. It was a command. Antony, known for his love of grandeur and his rather theatrical personality, fully expected Cleopatra to arrive as a humble supplicant, ready to explain her ambiguous conduct during the recent civil war. Remember her playing both sides, however subtly. He probably anticipated a rich queen, certainly, but perhaps one easily impressed by Roman might and his own considerable charm. What he received, however, was a masterclass in psychological warfare and theatrical entrance. Cleopatra, ever the shrewd manipulator of perception, understood that her arrival had to be a spectacle, designed not to impress Antony with Roman-style subservience, but to awe him with Egyptian wealth, ancient majesty, and her own unparalleled mystique. She delayed her arrival, letting Antony stew in Tarsus, building anticipation. This wasn't just a rude gesture. It was a deliberate power play, forcing the mighty Roman to wait, a subtle assertion of her own importance. And when she finally did arrive, it was not by land in a dusty procession, but by river, in a scene so magnificent it quickly became legendary. Imagine, if you will, the river Cydnus flowing through Tarsus. On its waters appeared a gilded barge, its stern plated with gold, its sails of royal purple billowing in the breeze, perfumed by exotic incense wafting from silver censers. Rowed by silver oars that kept time to the music of flutes and lyres, it glided into view. Cleopatra herself reclined under a canopy woven with gold, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, or perhaps Isis, the Egyptian goddess with whom she often associated herself. Her handmaidens, dressed as Nereids and Graces, ministered to her, while boys, dressed as Cupids, fanned her. The banks of the river were reportedly lined with awestruck crowds, drawn from the city by the intoxicating scents and sounds. It was a sensory overload, a meticulously choreographed display of wealth, beauty, and divine presence. Antony, initially seated on his tribunal, was left speechless, his legions and the entire city abandoning their duties to witness this extraordinary spectacle. He was, to put it mildly, thoroughly upstaged. Historians still argue whether the entire scene played out exactly as described by Plutarch, but the core truth remains. Cleopatra made an unforgettable, show-stopping entrance designed to put Antony on the defensive from the start. It was ancient world marketing at its finest. Antony, intrigued and perhaps a little annoyed by being so utterly outmaneuvered, invited her to dinner. Cleopatra, seizing the initiative, famously replied that she would prefer he come to her, and so he did. The subsequent banquets hosted by Cleopatra were legendary for their extravagance. She reportedly spent astronomical sums on food, drink, and entertainment, even melting pearls into vinegar to drink. A rather dramatic display of wealth, and perhaps a subtle jab at Roman austerity. These weren't just parties. They were carefully crafted demonstrations of Egypt's vast resources and her own personal grandeur, designed to convey to Antony that she was not a mere client queen, but a powerful ruler whose alliance was worth cultivating. Their initial meetings would have been negotiations disguised as social occasions. Antony had come to Tarsus to question her loyalty, to demand funds, and perhaps to reprimand her for her conduct during the war against the conspirators. But Cleopatra, with her unparalleled charm, her sharp intellect, and her multilingual fluency, she could speak to Antony directly in Greek, a rare quality among foreign monarchs, quickly turned the tables. She skillfully defended her actions, blaming the influence of her brother and his courtiers for any perceived disloyalty. More importantly, she made it clear that a stable, prosperous Egypt under her rule was far more beneficial to Rome and to Antony personally than a hostile or unstable one. The political dynamic shifted almost immediately. Antony, a man known for his susceptibility to female charm and his love of luxury, was utterly captivated. He saw not just a queen, but an intelligent, formidable ally whose resources could fund his ambitions and whose company he found intensely stimulating. What began as a formal summons quickly blossomed into a powerful political and personal relationship, one that would redefine the course of their lives and shake the foundations of the Roman world. This was no fleeting romance. This was an alliance forged in the crucible of ambition and attraction, an encounter that would ripple through history and ultimately lead to both their downfall. The queen had arrived, and Antony, for all his power, had truly met his match. The gilded barge had done its work. Antony, who had arrived in Tarsus expecting a humble subject, found himself utterly enthralled by Cleopatra, a woman who possessed not only captivating beauty and legendary charm, but also a fierce intellect and an unshakable sense of her own regal destiny. What began as a political summit quickly transformed into a deep, passionate relationship, a union of two formidable personalities drawn together by ambition, power, and perhaps genuine affection. This wasn't just a fleeting affair. It was the foundation of an alliance that would send tremors through the Roman world. After their initial meetings and lavish banquets in Tarsus, Antony, completely under Cleopatra's spell, left his administrative duties in the hands of his lieutenants and followed her back to Alexandria in late 40 BCE. Imagine the whispers among his Roman retinue, the raised eyebrows, the quiet concern that their formidable leader was being led astray by this Oriental queen. But Antony, a man who lived large and embraced excess, seemed not to care. He spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE in Alexandria, abandoning his official duties to immerse himself in Cleopatra's world. It was a prolonged holiday of sorts, filled with feasts, entertainments, and intellectual discourse. They formed a legendary drinking society known as the Inimitable Livers, engaging in elaborate games and competitions. One famous story, perhaps exaggerated but illustrative, tells of Cleopatra winning a bet by dissolving a priceless pearl in vinegar and drinking it, simply to demonstrate her vast wealth. Historians still argue whether such extravagant displays were primarily for show or genuine examples of their opulent lifestyle. But it's clear they lived on a scale that dwarfed even Roman luxury. During this winter in Alexandria, their personal bond deepened irrevocably. Cleopatra, with her vast knowledge of the East and her political acumen, provided Antony with invaluable insights into the complex dynamics of the region he was now tasked with governing. She was not just a queen, she was a strategic advisor, a partner in governance, offering him a perspective that few Romans could. For Antony, who often preferred action to administration, her intelligence and understanding of the nuances of Eastern politics would have been immensely appealing. He saw in her not just a lover, but a powerful ally whose kingdom could provide the resources he needed for his military campaigns and political ambitions. Their union soon bore fruit, literally. In 40 BCE, while Antony was away from Egypt, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, a boy named Alexander Helios, Helios meaning sun, symbolizing his connection to the East and perhaps a subtle nod to Alexander the Great, and a girl named Cleopatra Selene, Selene meaning moon, her celestial counterpart. The birth of twins, especially a boy and a girl, was seen as an auspicious sign in the ancient world, reinforcing the divine nature of their union and its potential for a new dynasty that would combine the power of Rome and Egypt. These children, following Caesarion, further solidified the personal and dynastic ties between Cleopatra and Antony. It was an unmistakable declaration to the world. Their relationship was serious, fertile, and designed to create a lasting legacy. However, Antony's prolonged absence in Egypt caused significant political problems back in Rome. While he was reveling with Cleopatra, his wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius Antonius initiated a revolt against Octavian in Italy, known as the Perusian War. This conflict, though ultimately unsuccessful, forced Antony to leave Cleopatra and return to Rome to deal with the fallout. It was a stark reminder that despite his power in the East, he was still intrinsically tied to the volatile politics of the Roman Republic and his uneasy alliance with Octavian. Cleopatra, no doubt, understood the necessity of his departure, but it would have been a painful separation after their intense period together. Upon his return to Italy, Antony was forced to reconcile with Octavian, a necessity dictated by the power dynamics of the Triumvirate. This reconciliation was cemented by the Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BCE, which reaffirmed the division of the Roman world and, most significantly for Antony, involved his marriage to Octavia the Younger, Octavian's sister. This political marriage was a blatant attempt to solidify the fragile alliance between the two triumvirs. Imagine Cleopatra's reaction when she heard this news in Alexandria. The man who had spent a winter in her palace, fathered her children, and seemingly pledged his loyalty, was now married to his rival's sister. It was a stark reminder of the harsh realities of Roman power politics, a brutal lesson in the fleeting nature of personal loyalty when faced with political expediency. Historians still argue about Cleopatra's precise feelings: anger, betrayal, or a cynical understanding of how the game was played. Likely a mix of all three. Despite this political marriage, Antony's heart and his strategic interests remained largely in the East and ultimately with Cleopatra. While his marriage to Octavia produced 2 daughters and was, by all accounts, a relatively happy and respectable union in Roman terms, it was a political necessity, not a relationship of passion or strategic partnership. The stage was now set for the next chapter of their complicated relationship, one where Antony would increasingly turn his gaze back towards Egypt, towards Cleopatra, and towards the grand ambitions they shared, much to the growing fury of Octavian back in Rome. So, Antony, now politically married to Octavia, Octavian's sister, found himself in a rather awkward position. His heart, or at least his grandest ambitions, remained firmly in the East and with Cleopatra. The political marriage to Octavia was a strategic necessity, a truce in the uneasy alliance of the Second Triumvirate. But it did little to diminish his deep connection with the Queen of Egypt. He spent several years after the Treaty of Brundisium, 40 BCE, campaigning in the East, dealing with the Parthian threat, and consolidating Rome's presence. But his thoughts, and eventually his actions, continually drifted back to Alexandria. It's like having a perfectly sensible, respectable dinner, but secretly longing for the wild, exotic feast you had last week. During this period of separation, from 40 BC to 37 BC, Cleopatra continued to rule Egypt, nurturing her young children, Caesarion and the twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. She focused on strengthening her kingdom, managing its vast resources, and maintaining its stability amidst the ongoing Roman turmoil. She also continued to develop Alexandria as a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars and artists, maintaining the Ptolemaic legacy of intellectual patronage. She was patiently waiting, knowing that Antony would eventually return to her side. The turning point came in 37 BCE, when Antony, weary of his political obligations in Rome and eager to launch a major campaign against the Parthian Empire, a formidable Roman enemy in the east, needed significant financial and logistical support. Where better to find it than in the wealthy coffers of Egypt and with the capable leadership of Cleopatra. He sent for her, and they met in Antioch, in modern-day Turkey. This reunion marked a significant escalation in their relationship and a blatant disregard for his marriage to Octavia, a slight that Octavian would never forget, and certainly never forgive. It was during this meeting in Antioch that Antony made a series of truly astonishing decisions, known as the Donations of Antioch. These were not simple gifts. They were grand, sweeping transfers of Roman-controlled territory to Cleopatra and her children. He effectively gave her vast swathes of land that included parts of Cilicia, Phoenicia, Coele-Syria, Cyprus, and even portions of Judea and Arabia. Imagine giving away chunks of your country's property to your foreign partner. This was a truly unprecedented act for a Roman general, and it sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. Historians still argue whether Antony's motivations were primarily romantic devotion to Cleopatra, a shrewd political calculation to create a powerful, loyal buffer state in the East, or a combination of both. It was probably a very generous mix, much like a potent ancient Roman cocktail. For Cleopatra, these donations were an immense victory. They not only significantly expanded her kingdom's borders and wealth, making her the most powerful monarch in the Eastern Mediterranean, but they also formalized the dynastic ambitions she shared with Antony. These territories were meant to be ruled by her, and more importantly, by her children with Antony. It was a clear signal that Antony intended to build a new empire in the East, with Egypt as its heart and Cleopatra's children as its future rulers. She was no longer just a client queen. She was a partner in empire building, a co-visionary in a grand scheme that directly challenged Octavian's authority and his vision for Rome. This act, however, was also a colossal strategic blunder in terms of Roman public opinion. Octavian and his allies in Rome immediately seized upon the donations of Antioch as irrefutable proof of Antony's complete subjugation to Cleopatra and his alleged Oriental decadence. They painted him as a man corrupted by an exotic foreign queen, abandoning Roman values and actively dismembering the Republic's territory to create a new foreign monarchy. The propaganda machine went into overdrive, meticulously crafting a narrative that demonized Cleopatra as a dangerous sorceress, a threat to Roman morality and the very fabric of the Republic. This was character assassination on an imperial scale, laying the groundwork for the inevitable confrontation. Adding fuel to the fire, Antony and Cleopatra also legitimized their twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and even Caesarion, though still not formally acknowledged by Antony as Caesar's son in Roman law, in a grand public ceremony. They were dressed in regal attire, proclaimed as rulers of these newly granted territories, and paraded before the populace. It was a bold, almost defiant assertion of their dynastic claims, a clear challenge to Octavian's sole claim to Caesar's legacy. Antony, in his grandiose fashion, seemed utterly unconcerned with Roman sensibilities. He was, to put it mildly, living his best life, consequences be damned. From this point forward, the conflict between Antony and Octavian became personal, intensely ideological, and increasingly irreconcilable. The donations of Antioch were not just territorial transfers. They were a declaration of intent, a vision of an Eastern empire centered around Egypt, fundamentally opposed to Octavian's vision of a Roman-centric West. Cleopatra had achieved immense power and influence, but she had also become the lightning rod for Octavian's carefully crafted narrative of Roman exceptionalism and moral purity. The stage was now set for the final devastating act of the Roman civil wars, with Cleopatra and Antony at its very center, marching towards a destiny that would be both glorious and tragic. The donations of Antioch, as we've discussed, weren't just land grants. They were a thunderclap, signaling Antony's audacious vision for an Eastern empire with Cleopatra and their children at its heart. This radical move, however, was also a colossal strategic blunder in the fiercely competitive and propaganda-driven world of Roman politics. Back in Rome, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, was not just observing these developments. He was meticulously cataloguing them, building a devastating case against Antony and, more powerfully, against Cleopatra. The stage was now set for a propaganda war that would make modern political campaigns look like polite debates over tea. Octavian, a master manipulator of public opinion and a shrewd political operator, understood that he couldn't simply accuse Antony of treason. That was too blunt. Instead, he launched a relentless, multi-pronged smear campaign, carefully crafted to demonize Antony as a degenerate, un-Roman figure, and Cleopatra as the insidious, exotic temptress who had corrupted him. This wasn't just casual gossip. It was a systematic, sustained effort to poison public perception in Rome against the pair. He didn't just whisper, he shouted from the rooftops of the Forum, painting a vivid, albeit entirely biased, picture of their decadence. Central to Octavian's propaganda was the portrayal of Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign sorceress, an Oriental queen who had enslaved Antony with her charms and was actively plotting to subjugate Rome. This played expertly on existing Roman prejudices against Eastern cultures, which were often viewed as luxurious, effeminate, and morally corrupt. She was depicted not as a legitimate monarch, but as a manipulative siren, a whore queen, to use the utterly charming language of the time, who sought to bring the glorious republic to its knees. Remember her opulent entrance at Tarsus. Octavian's spin doctors would have had a field day with that, turning a display of regal majesty into an example of wasteful excess and un-Roman depravity. Historians still argue about the true extent of Roman hatred towards Cleopatra, or if it was largely a construct of Octavian's propaganda. It's safe to say, however, that it was effective enough to sway public opinion against her. Antony, too, became a primary target. He was accused of abandoning his Roman wife, Octavia, Octavian's beloved sister, remember, for a foreign paramour, a clear sign of his moral decay. His adoption of Egyptian customs, his participation in Cleopatra's lavish lifestyle, and especially the donations of Alexandria, the public ceremony where he formally acknowledged his children with Cleopatra and granted them vast territories, were all presented as undeniable proof of his betrayal of Roman values. Octavian claimed that Antony was under Cleopatra's complete control, that he was so infatuated he was willing to transfer Roman territory to her children, and even move the capital of the Roman Empire to Alexandria. Can you believe it, citizens? The propagandists would cry, "Our glorious Rome, subservient to an Egyptian queen." It was a powerful narrative, tapping into Roman pride and xenophobia. The ultimate accusation against Antony and Cleopatra was that they harbored ambitions to establish a universal monarchy, an oriental despotism with Alexandria as its capital, and that they planned to conquer Rome itself. This played directly into Roman fears of kingship, a concept they had violently rejected centuries earlier. Octavian painted a terrifying picture. Roman citizens living under the rule of an Egyptian pharaoh, subject to foreign gods and foreign laws. He even went so far as to claim that Cleopatra planned to sit on the Capitol in Rome and dispense justice. A truly horrifying image for the proud Romans. This was, of course, a gross exaggeration, but it was incredibly effective. Octavian also meticulously collected Antony's perceived transgressions. He intercepted Antony's will, which reportedly confirmed his desire to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra, and sensationally read it aloud in the Senate. This was a masterstroke, presenting seemingly irrefutable proof of Antony's complete abandonment of Rome and his deep devotion to Cleopatra and Egypt. The Roman people were shocked and outraged. It was the ancient equivalent of leaking compromising emails, but with way more dramatic flair. This relentless propaganda campaign was incredibly successful. By the time the final confrontation arrived, Octavian had largely succeeded in turning Roman public opinion decisively against Antony and Cleopatra. He had framed the coming conflict not as another Roman civil war, but as a righteous crusade to defend Rome's honor, its values, and its very existence from a foreign threat personified by the seductive and dangerous Queen of Egypt. He had effectively transformed a complex political struggle into a clear-cut battle between good, Roman virtue, and evil, Eastern decadence. Historians still argue about whether Octavian genuinely believed his own propaganda, or if it was purely a cynical political tool, but its impact was undeniable. The stage was now set for the final cataclysmic showdown, with the entire weight of Roman public opinion, carefully manipulated by Octavian, now arrayed against the fated lovers. The relentless drumbeat of Octavian's propaganda had finally reached a fever pitch, meticulously crafting an image of Antony as a corrupted Roman and Cleopatra as the ultimate foreign menace. The political maneuvering, the territorial disputes, and the increasingly personal insults had all been leading to one inevitable conclusion: open warfare. The fragile peace of the Triumvirate had completely shattered, and the Roman world braced itself for the final decisive confrontation between Octavian in the west and Antony and Cleopatra in the east. It was the ancient equivalent of two superpowers squaring off, but with way more personal drama and fewer nuclear codes. Antony, aware that conflict was unavoidable, began to gather his forces in the east. He commanded a formidable army of Roman legions, supplemented by troops from his client kingdoms and a substantial fleet. Cleopatra, for her part, brought to the table the immense wealth of Egypt, its formidable navy, and its vast resources. She was not just a financier, she was a sovereign, a co-commander in this grand, perilous venture. Her fleet, built with Egyptian timber and manned by skilled sailors, was a crucial component of their combined strength. This was her kingdom's survival at stake, and she committed fully. The strategic decision was made to confront Octavian's forces at sea. The location chosen was the Gulf of Actium, off the western coast of Greece. This wasn't a random choice. It was strategically positioned, offering a relatively protected bay for their fleet. Antony and Cleopatra established their main camp at Actium, preparing for the impending naval battle. They had a larger number of ships than Octavian, but many of Cleopatra's vessels, designed for the calmer waters of the Nile and the Red Sea, were slower and heavier than the nimble Roman warships. This technical detail, historians still argue, may have been a critical factor in the battle's outcome. On September 2nd, 31st BCE, the fateful Battle of Actium unfolded. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of warships, manned by thousands of soldiers and sailors, converging on the calm waters of the Ionian Sea. The air would have been thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and the metallic tang of impending conflict. Trumpets blared, war cries echoed, and the rhythmic splash of oars filled the air. It was a spectacle of ancient naval warfare, an immense clash of wills and firepower. Antony commanded the center of his fleet, while Cleopatra, ever present as a co-commander and symbol of their alliance, positioned her 60 Egyptian ships in the rear, reportedly laden with the royal treasury. This placement, as we will see, would become a central point of contention and controversy. The battle itself was chaotic and brutal. Antony's heavy ships, while formidable, struggled to maneuver against Octavian's lighter, more agile vessels, commanded by his brilliant admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa was a tactical genius known for his innovative naval strategies, and he expertly used his superior maneuverability to outflank and isolate Antony's larger ships. The Roman civil war aspect meant that Romans were fighting Romans, a tragic waste of life that had characterized the preceding decades. It wasn't about patriotism. It was about loyalty to a specific leader. Then came the moment that would forever define the narrative of the battle, and indeed, the fate of Antony and Cleopatra. The controversial retreat. In the midst of the fierce fighting, Cleopatra's ships, with her aboard, suddenly hoisted their sails and broke through the battle lines, making for the open sea. Antony, seeing her fleet depart, reportedly abandoned his command ship, transferred to a faster quinquereme and followed her. This act has been endlessly debated by historians. Was it a prearranged strategic withdrawal, a desperate attempt to save the treasury and their lives for a later fight? Or was it a moment of panicked flight, a betrayal of his men and his cause? Roman sources, heavily biased by Octavian's propaganda, painted it as an act of cowardice, a definitive sign of Antony's emasculation by the foreign queen. He ran after his Egyptian paramour like a slave, they would have roared. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's retreat was part of a larger plan to escape an unfavorable naval engagement and continue the war on land, or if it was a spontaneous decision to flee. There's a theory that their heavier ships were being encircled, and Cleopatra, seeing the dire situation, made a desperate dash for freedom, hoping to preserve what was left of their forces and resources. Whatever the reason, Antony's decision to follow her was catastrophic for his morale and the loyalty of his remaining forces. His fleet, left rudderless and demoralized, was eventually crushed by Agrippa. His land legions, hearing of their general's flight, largely defected to Octavian in the following days. The Battle of Actium was a decisive victory for Octavian, not just militarily, but psychologically. It marked the definitive end of Antony and Cleopatra's ambitions to establish an Eastern empire and set the stage for Octavian's sole dominance. Their retreat to Egypt was not a strategic withdrawal. It was a desperate flight towards an uncertain future, leaving behind a ruined fleet and a rapidly collapsing army. The sun, it seemed, was beginning to set on the last great Hellenistic kingdom and on the tragic romance that had dared to challenge the might of Rome. The world watched as the once glorious figures of Antony and Cleopatra began their long, slow, and ultimately unavoidable descent. The disastrous Battle of Actium was more than just a military defeat. It was a psychological and political cataclysm for Antony and Cleopatra. Their grand ambitions for an Eastern empire lay shattered on the Ionian Sea, and the immediate aftermath was a desperate flight back to Egypt. Imagine the somber mood on Cleopatra's ship as they sailed away from the wreckage. The whispers of defeat, the gnawing certainty that their world had just been irrevocably altered. Antony, having abandoned his men, must have been reeling from the utter humiliation, his formidable pride severely wounded. Upon their return to Egypt, they faced an agonizing reality. Octavian was coming, and he would come with the full, relentless force of Rome's victorious legions. There was no escaping the inevitable confrontation. Yet, even in defeat, Cleopatra and Antony displayed a remarkable, almost defiant, resilience. They knew their time was limited, but they were determined to make the most of it, whether by preparing for a final stand or by attempting desperate diplomatic maneuvers. Historians still argue whether their actions in these final months were signs of continued strategic thinking or merely the frantic flailing of two desperate rulers clinging to hope. Perhaps it was a tragic mix of both, punctuated by moments of despair and defiant excess. Antony, in particular, seemed to struggle with the weight of his defeat. He retreated into a period of deep despair and self-pity, isolating himself in a villa on the island of Pharos, calling himself Timon, a legendary misanthrope. It was a stark contrast to his usual boisterous, larger-than-life persona. Cleopatra, however, ever the pragmatist, refused to succumb to despondency. She began making preparations, not just for defense, but for potential escape. She initiated a plan to transport her remaining fleet, or at least a portion of it, across the Isthmus of Suez to the Red Sea, hoping to find refuge in distant lands like India, beyond Rome's reach. It was a bold, almost fantastical scheme, reflecting her desperate desire to preserve her dynasty and her children. Imagine the logistical nightmare of dragging warships overland, a testament to her determination and perhaps her desperation. Unfortunately, this daring plan was thwarted by local tribes who destroyed some of the ships, a sign that fate, it seemed, was conspiring against them. Despite these setbacks, life in Alexandria, under Cleopatra's lead, took on a surreal quality. Aware that their time might be short, they reportedly engaged in a period of lavish indulgence and defiant revelry. This wasn't necessarily a sign of frivolity. It was perhaps a conscious effort to project an image of strength and stability to their subjects and to themselves. A defiant last hurrah in the face of impending doom. They founded a new society, the Companions in Death, or Synapothanumeni, echoing their earlier inimitable livers. This morbid name suggests a dark humor, a resigned acceptance of their shared fate, and a determination to face it together. These were not just parties, they were acts of shared fatalism, a way to numb the gnawing fear of the inevitable. Meanwhile, Octavian was not idle. He meticulously consolidated his control over the Roman East, securing client kingdoms and ensuring no one could rally support for Antony and Cleopatra. He advanced slowly but inexorably towards Egypt, tightening the noose. His propaganda continued relentlessly, portraying the coming invasion as a liberation of Egypt from the corrupting influence of Cleopatra and the tyrannical rule of Antony. He carefully spun the narrative to frame it as a just war, designed to restore order and protect Roman honor, rather than a brutal conquest. As Octavian's forces drew closer, Antony made a final, desperate attempt to rally his remaining legions and put up a fight. He even achieved a small, temporary victory in a skirmish outside Alexandria, which briefly lifted his spirits and those of his loyalists. This brief flicker of hope, however, was quickly extinguished. The vast majority of his land forces, demoralized and recognizing the futility of continued resistance, began to defect to Octavian. The end was clearly in sight. In the face of this overwhelming threat, Cleopatra also engaged in desperate diplomatic maneuvers. She secretly sent messages to Octavian, attempting to negotiate. She offered to abdicate in favor of her children, promising to step aside if he would guarantee their safety and the continuation of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Octavian, ever the shrewd pragmatist, responded, but his terms were simple and unyielding. Cleopatra must surrender unconditionally, and Antony must be handed over. He refused to give any guarantees regarding her children, though he hinted that if she delivered Antony to him, her own life might be spared. It was a cruel, calculated offer, designed to sow discord between the doomed lovers. Historians still argue about the precise details of these secret negotiations, but it's clear that Cleopatra tried every avenue, however desperate, to save her kingdom and her family. But Octavian had tasted victory, and he wanted absolute, unequivocal triumph, the stage was set for the final heartbreaking collapse of their world. The final act of this grand tragedy was upon them, with Octavian's legions closing in on Alexandria and their own forces dwindling rapidly due to desertions. Antony and Cleopatra faced their ultimate reckoning. The defiant revelry and desperate schemes of the past months now gave way to a grim reality. The city of Alexandria, once a beacon of Hellenistic splendor, was about to become the backdrop for the final heartbreaking downfall of the last pharaoh of Egypt and the Roman triumvirate who had chosen love over empire. Imagine the palpable tension in the air, the fear mixed with a defiant sense of doom, as the shadow of Rome loomed larger with each passing day. As Octavian's forces arrived at the gates of Alexandria in early August of 30 BCE, the situation became utterly hopeless for Antony. His last remaining units, demoralized and outnumbered, put up a token resistance. His fleet, what was left of it, sailed out to meet Octavian's navy, but in a final devastating blow, they either surrendered or actively defected to Octavian's side without a fight. This betrayal was the ultimate humiliation for Antony, a testament to how completely his power and influence had eroded. His land forces, witnessing the naval defection, also abandoned him en masse. It was a complete collapse, a rapid unraveling of everything he had built. Antony, broken and utterly defeated, retreated to the palace. In a moment of utter despair and confusion, he received a false report that Cleopatra had committed suicide. This, perhaps, was the final straw for a man whose life had been defined by grand ambitions and profound losses. Believing his beloved queen was dead, and unwilling to face the humiliation of capture by Octavian, Antony decided to take his own life. He attempted to fall on his sword, but, in a rather tragically pathetic moment, he botched the attempt. The blade inflicted a wound, but it was not immediately fatal. Historians still argue whether his first attempt was truly a botched suicide or a cry for help. But the outcome was the same: a slow, agonizing demise. In agonizing pain, Antony learned that Cleopatra was, in fact, still alive, having barricaded herself in the monument she had constructed, a magnificent tomb designed to protect her and her treasury, not an actual place of death. He begged to be taken to her, to die in her arms. His loyal attendants, with immense effort, carried the dying Antony to the monument. Unable to open the heavy doors, Cleopatra and her two handmaidens reportedly hauled the mortally wounded Antony up to the window with ropes, a truly dramatic and heartbreaking scene. Imagine the desperation, the sheer physical effort, as they pulled his heavy frame upwards. He bled out in her arms, exchanging a final whispered farewell. He died on August 1st, 30 BCE, bringing a tragic end to one of the most powerful and flamboyant figures of the Roman world. Cleopatra, now utterly alone and surrounded by Octavian's victorious forces, was captured shortly after Antony's death. Octavian, ever the calculating pragmatist, immediately secured her person and her treasury. His primary goal was to parade her in his triumphal procession back in Rome, a clear symbol of his ultimate victory over the East and the vanquishing of his most potent rival. He wanted to display her as a trophy, a tangible representation of his triumph. He placed her under close guard, ensuring she had no means to escape or take her own life. even assigning his freedman Epaphroditus to watch her constantly. It was a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. During her captivity, Cleopatra reportedly attempted one final desperate diplomatic gamble. She sent messages to Octavian requesting an audience. When granted, she used every ounce of her famous charm, intellect, and regal presence to try and sway him. She presented him with a detailed account of Egypt's treasury, deliberately holding back some items to create a sense of intrigue. She appealed to his mercy, speaking of her children and the future of her dynasty. She was trying to negotiate, to find any way to preserve some semblance of power for her offspring, or at least ensure their survival. Historians still argue about the true nature of their conversations. Did she genuinely try to seduce him, or was it purely a political performance? Given Octavian's cold, calculating nature, it's highly unlikely she could have charmed him as she had Caesar and Antony. He was immune to her legendary allure, seeing her only as a political obstacle and a triumphal prize. He offered vague promises about her children, but refused to give any firm guarantees, keeping her hopes and her compliance alive. But Cleopatra, despite her desperate pleas and her seemingly compliant demeanor, had a secret plan. She knew the indignity of being paraded through Rome in chains, a spectacle of a conquered queen, would be the ultimate humiliation, a fate worse than death for a woman of her pride and royal lineage. She was a pharaoh, a goddess in her own right, and she would not allow herself to be reduced to a Roman trophy. Her capture and her ultimate defiance set the stage for one of history's most iconic and mysterious suicides. The stage was set for her final dramatic act, an ending chosen on her own terms. With Antony dead and Octavian's legions in control of Alexandria, Cleopatra found herself in the ultimate confinement, a prisoner in her own city, meticulously guarded to ensure she couldn't cheat Octavian of his most coveted prize, her public humiliation in a Roman triumph. But for Cleopatra, a queen who considered herself a living goddess, the very idea of being paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, a spectacle for the conquering general, was an unspeakable indignity, a fate she simply refused to accept. Imagine the profound despair and fierce pride warring within her in those final days. She was determined to dictate the terms of her own end, to choose her destiny even in defeat. The details surrounding Cleopatra's final act are shrouded in mystery and legend, making it one of history's most debated and iconic suicides. The generally accepted account, passed down by ancient historians like Plutarch and Dio Cassius, involves a snake, specifically an asp, a small Egyptian cobra, often associated with divine royalty. Historians still argue about the precise species of snake, or if it was even a snake at all, with some theories suggesting poison or another discreet method. But the enduring image of the asp is powerful, deeply symbolic of her Egyptian heritage and her desire for a death that was both regal and secret. Cleopatra was held in a relatively luxurious part of the palace, but under constant surveillance. Yet somehow, she managed to arrange for the means of her death to be smuggled in. The most popular version of the story claims the asp was brought to her in a basket of figs, or perhaps hidden within a vase of flowers. The guards, perhaps complacent or intentionally lax, failed to thoroughly inspect the seemingly innocent delivery. This act of deception speaks volumes about Cleopatra's cunning, even in her darkest hour, and her sheer determination to control her final narrative. It was an ingenious way to bypass the watchful eyes of her Roman captors, turning a seemingly innocuous delivery into the instrument of her defiance. You might even say she had a rather fruitful plan. On August 12th, 30th BCE, just 11 days after Antony's death, Cleopatra made her final preparations. She reportedly bathed, dressed in her finest royal robes, and lay on her golden couch, ready to meet her end with dignity and ceremony. She wrote a letter to Octavian requesting to be buried alongside Antony. This final request was a subtle act of defiance, a quiet assertion of her unwavering loyalty to Antony, even in death, and a final jab at Octavian, who had tried so hard to separate them. It was a plea but also a declaration. The moment of her death itself is often depicted dramatically, with the asp biting her arm or breast. Ancient sources suggest that she deliberately provoked the snake, perhaps even holding it to herself, ensuring a swift and relatively painless end. The poison of the asp would have induced a gradual paralysis, leading to a peaceful death, often associated with a divine sleep. This method allowed her to die with the regal composure she so desperately desired, avoiding the brutal public spectacle that Octavian had intended. When Octavian's guards finally realized what was happening, bursting into her chambers, they found her lifeless, with her two loyal handmaidens, Iras and Charmian, either already dead or dying by her side, choosing to follow their queen into eternity. Charmian, as she lay dying, reportedly straightened Cleopatra's diadem, a final gesture of devotion and defiance. "It is well done, and fitting for the descendant of so many kings," she is said to have uttered, perfectly summing up Cleopatra's pride. Cleopatra's suicide achieved its intended purpose. She denied Octavian the ultimate prize of parading her in his triumph, while her treasures and her children, Caesarion, Alexander Helios, and Cleopatra Selene, were indeed brought to Rome. The absence of the living, breathing Queen of Egypt diminished the spectacle for Octavian. He was reportedly both frustrated and perhaps a little impressed by her final act of defiance. He ultimately granted her wish to be buried alongside Antony, a testament to his grudging respect for her spirit, or perhaps a pragmatic decision to avoid further unrest in Egypt. Her death marked the official end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a lineage that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. With Cleopatra gone, Egypt became a direct Roman province, administered by a prefect appointed by the Roman emperor. Its vast wealth and grain supplies were now firmly under Rome's control, a crucial resource that would sustain the Roman Empire for centuries to come. The era of independent pharaohs was over, a millennia-long chapter of history closed forever. Historians still argue about the long-term impact of Egypt's annexation on the Roman Empire. Did its wealth contribute to Roman stability, or did it merely fuel further imperial ambitions? It certainly made Rome richer. Cleopatra's decision to choose her own death, rather than endure the humiliation of a Roman triumph, cemented her legendary status. It transformed her from a defeated queen into a defiant symbol of pride and independence. Her final act, shrouded in ancient mystique, ensured that she would be remembered not as Octavian's captive, but as the formidable Queen of Egypt who defied Rome to the very end. This tragic yet powerful conclusion became the bedrock of her enduring myth, securing her place in history as one of its most enigmatic and captivating figures. So, the last pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra VII, Cleopatra, met her chosen end, denying Octavian the ultimate spectacle of her humiliation. Her death, on August 12th, 30th BCE, wasn't just the end of a remarkable life. It was the definitive end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek Macedonian lineage that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. This moment marked a monumental turning point in ancient history. Egypt, a land of ancient gods, pharaohs, and unparalleled wealth, ceased to be an independent kingdom and officially became a Roman province. Imagine the quiet solemnity in Alexandria, a city that had been the heart of a vibrant empire, now awaiting its new Roman masters. With Cleopatra gone, Octavian wasted no time in fully integrating Egypt into the burgeoning Roman Empire. He understood the immense strategic and economic value of Egypt. Its fertile Nile Delta was the breadbasket of the ancient world, producing vast quantities of grain crucial for feeding Rome's massive population. Its immense wealth, accumulated over millennia, was a much-needed boost to the Roman treasury, depleted by decades of civil war. Octavian appointed a Roman prefect, Gaius Cornelius Gallus, to govern Egypt, signaling that this was no ordinary province. Egypt was treated as his personal domain, reflecting its unique importance and his desire to keep its immense resources directly under his imperial control, rather than allowing it to be managed by the Senate. It was like acquiring the world's largest, most lucrative private farm. The annexation of Egypt brought about profound changes. The Ptolemaic administrative structure, largely Greek in nature, was slowly replaced by Roman systems. Roman legions were stationed permanently in the country to maintain order and secure the lucrative grain shipments. Alexandria, while retaining its status as a major intellectual and commercial hub, now operated under Roman authority. The vast library of Alexandria, though it had suffered damage during Caesar's time, continued to attract scholars, but its glory days as the unparalleled center of learning gradually waned under Roman rule. Historians still argue about the precise timeline and extent of the library's decline, with some blaming further fires and others pointing to a more gradual shift in intellectual focus. The fate of Cleopatra's children was, of course, a poignant and tragic chapter in this transition. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, was seen by Octavian as the most significant threat. He was Caesar's only biological son, a living symbol of the monarchical legacy Octavian was so keen to appropriate and sanitize for his own political narrative. Caesarion had been sent by Cleopatra towards India, perhaps as a final desperate escape attempt, but he was lured back by his tutor, Rhodan, who believed Octavian might spare him. This was a fatal miscalculation. Upon his return, Octavian, on the advice of his close confidant, Arrius Didymus, "Too many Caesars is not a good thing," ordered Caesarion's execution. It was a cold, calculated act to remove any potential rival to his claim as Caesar's sole heir. The young prince, barely 17, met a quiet, brutal end, forever silencing the direct bloodline of Julius Caesar. A rather chilling, pragmatic approach to political inheritance, wouldn't you say? Cleopatra's children by Antony, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome by Octavian. Unlike Caesarion, they posed no direct threat to his claim as Caesar's heir. They were paraded in Octavian's triple triumph in 29 BCE, a public display of Rome's victory over the East and a symbolic end to the civil wars. They were then handed over to the care of Octavia the Younger, Antony's former wife and Octavian's sister. Octavia, known for her noble character and compassion, raised them as her own, alongside her own children and Antony's daughters by Fulvia. It's a rather remarkable, almost tender twist in an otherwise brutal tale of power. Historians still argue whether Octavia's actions were genuine kindness or a savvy political move to showcase Roman magnanimity. Perhaps it was a combination of both. Cleopatra Selene, the most prominent of Antony's children with Cleopatra, eventually married King Juba II of Mauritania, a client king of Rome, and became a learned and influential queen in her own right. Her brothers, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, likely died young or faded from the historical record, their fates less certain. Their lives were a testament to the turbulent currents of Roman politics, surviving only through the grace of their captor, a stark contrast to the royal destiny their parents had envisioned. The annexation of Egypt was a pivotal moment in the formation of the Roman Empire. It provided the final piece of the puzzle for Octavian, securing his financial power and solidifying his personal authority. With Egypt under his heel, he could truly claim mastery of the Mediterranean world. This immense wealth and stability allowed him to embark on a vast program of public works, military reforms, and cultural rejuvenation that would define the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, for centuries. But it also meant the complete extinguishing of the vibrant ancient civilization of the pharaohs as an independent power. The age of the pharaohs, in its independent form, was definitively over. So, with Egypt firmly under Roman control, and the last of her children either executed or transported to Rome, the curtain definitively fell on Cleopatra's historical reality as an independent queen. Yet, even as her life ended, her legend began. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How some people, even centuries after their demise, continue to live on, transformed by the fertile ground of human imagination. Cleopatra, more than almost any other figure from antiquity, has transcended mere history to become a universal archetype, a symbol that means different things to different ages. The immediate aftermath of her death saw the rise of the Octavianic narrative, a powerful, state-sponsored version of her story designed to legitimize his victory and solidify his rule. In this Roman propaganda, Cleopatra was not a queen, but a dangerous seductress, an oriental temptress who had corrupted the noble Roman Marc Antony and threatened the very fabric of the Republic. She was depicted as decadent, manipulative, and sexually insatiable, a foreign threat to Roman virtue. This portrayal, heavily influenced by Roman prejudices against powerful foreign women and Eastern cultures, successfully demonized her in the Roman psyche. It was a classic example of winner writes the history, painting his defeated rival and his foreign paramour in the darkest possible light. Historians still argue about the true extent to which this propaganda shaped contemporary Roman views, but its enduring power is undeniable. However, even within Roman literature, there were glimpses of a more complex figure. Poets like Horace, while celebrating Octavian's victory, acknowledged her regal pride in choosing her own death. Later, writers like Plutarch, writing centuries after her death, offered a more nuanced, albeit still Roman-centric, account of her life, detailing her intelligence, charm, and linguistic prowess, even as they recounted her more scandalous moments. These accounts, though not without their biases, began to lay the groundwork for a more multifaceted understanding of the Queen. Through the medieval period, Cleopatra's story often faded into obscurity, or was reinterpreted through a Christian lens, where she might appear as a tragic figure, a victim of passion, or a symbol of pagan excess. Her image was often intertwined with other powerful but ultimately doomed women from antiquity, serving as moralizing tales. The focus was less on her political power and more on her perceived moral failings. It was a pretty harsh judgment, given the sheer political genius she exhibited. The Renaissance saw a renewed interest in classical antiquity, and with it, a re-emergence of Cleopatra. She became a muse for artists, playwrights, and poets, often depicted in grand, dramatic scenes, emphasizing her beauty and her tragic romance. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written in the early 17th century, is perhaps the most enduring and influential interpretation from this period. Shakespeare's play transformed her into a figure of immense poetic power and tragic grandeur, a woman whose passion and ambition were both her strength and her downfall. His Cleopatra is fiery, intelligent, mercurial, and ultimately deeply human. This play, more than any historical text, cemented her image in the Western cultural imagination as the ultimate femme fatale, a passionate queen whose love could bring empires to their knees. The 18th and 19th centuries, with their fascination for exoticism and romanticism, further amplified the mythical Cleopatra. She appeared in operas, paintings, and increasingly popular novels, often as a symbol of unattainable beauty and dangerous allure. The discoveries of Egyptology in the 19th century, particularly the decipherment of hieroglyphs and the unearthing of ancient tombs, only added to the mystique, clothing her in the authenticity of ancient Egyptian art and artifacts, even if those artifacts predated her by millennia. She became synonymous with ancient Egypt itself, a symbol of its splendor and its mysteries. It's truly fascinating how a historical figure can be so malleable, reflecting the anxieties and fascinations of different eras. For the Romans, she was a foreign threat. For Shakespeare, a tragic lover. For the Victorians, an exotic dream. Each era projected its own desires and fears onto her, creating a tapestry of interpretation that makes separating fact from fiction an ongoing challenge for historians. The real Cleopatra, the woman who spoke multiple languages and navigated treacherous political waters, often gets lost in the glittering spectacle of her own myth. But it is this very fluidity, this endless capacity for reinterpretation, that ensures her enduring presence in our collective consciousness. She's not just history, She's a cultural phenomenon, a whispered secret, and a shouted legend all at once. The enduring myth of Cleopatra, born from Roman propaganda and later embellished by countless artistic and literary interpretations, continued its captivating journey into the 20th and 21st centuries, taking on new forms and reflecting modern sensibilities. If the Renaissance gave us the tragic queen of Shakespeare, the modern era has given us the glamorous Hollywood icon, the subject of historical debates, and even the occasional questionable fashion trend. It's truly amazing how a woman who died over 2,000 years ago can still inspire so much conversation, even arguments, over coffee tables and academic conferences. The advent of cinema brought Cleopatra to life on the silver screen, solidifying her image as a figure of breathtaking beauty and magnetic power. The most famous, of course, is the 1963 epic Cleopatra, starring the incomparable Elizabeth Taylor in the titular role, alongside Richard Burton as Marc Antony. This film, renowned for its lavish sets, extravagant costumes, and its equally extravagant budget. It was the highest-grossing film of 1963, but nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox, cemented Taylor's image as the definitive Cleopatra for a generation. Her iconic look, the heavy eyeliner, the elaborate wigs, the flowing gowns, became synonymous with the Queen, often overshadowing the historical complexities of her reign. This film and the real-life romance between Taylor and Burton that ignited on set only added another layer of scandalous allure to the Cleopatra myth. Historians still argue about the film's historical accuracy, but its cultural impact is undeniable. It's safe to say it wasn't a documentary, but it certainly was entertaining. Beyond the silver screen, Cleopatra has continued to be a rich subject for historians and scholars. Modern scholarship has largely moved beyond the sensationalist Roman accounts, attempting to peel back the layers of propaganda and myth to uncover the real Cleopatra. This involves meticulously analyzing ancient texts, archaeological evidence, and numismatic data, the study of coins, to reconstruct her life and reign with greater accuracy. This research often emphasizes her intellectual prowess, her multilingualism, and her formidable political acumen, rather than just her romantic entanglements. Scholars now view her as a highly capable ruler who skillfully navigated a treacherous political landscape, making pragmatic decisions to preserve her kingdom. She was a shrewd politician, not merely a siren. Despite these scholarly efforts, the popular image of Cleopatra often remains stubbornly rooted in the romanticized and often exoticized portrayals of the past. She continues to inspire popular culture in myriad ways, in novels, comic books, video games, and even as a recurring figure in fashion and beauty industries. Her distinctive appearance, particularly her famed eye makeup, has been reinterpreted countless times, proving that some trends truly are timeless. You still see hints of her influence in modern cosmetics, proving she was a true trendsetter. However, modern interpretations of Cleopatra also sometimes reflect contemporary debates about female power, Orientalism, and historical representation. There's an ongoing conversation about how to portray her without falling into the traps of historical stereotypes or reinforcing colonial narratives. Is she a symbol of female empowerment, defying a patriarchal Roman world? Or is she still, in some portrayals, inadvertently perpetuating stereotypes of the exotic other? These are complex questions that continue to fuel academic and popular discussions. One of the fascinating aspects of Cleopatra's enduring presence is the lingering scholarly debate about her actual appearance. Despite countless artistic renderings, there is no definitive, universally accepted portrait of her from her lifetime. The coins minted during her reign provide some clues, often depicting a woman with a prominent nose, a strong chin, and a somewhat stern expression, quite different from the delicate beauty often portrayed in Hollywood. Historians still argue about the accuracy of these coin portraits. Were they idealized or realistic? This ambiguity only adds to her mystique, allowing each generation to project its own ideal onto her. It's like a historical Rorschach test, where everyone sees a different queen. In essence, Cleopatra has become a canvas upon which different eras paint their fascinations and anxieties. She embodies the allure of ancient Egypt, the drama of Roman power struggles, and the timeless complexities of love and ambition. Her story continues to be retold, reinterpreted, and reimagined because it touches upon universal themes: power, seduction, betrayal, and the desperate fight for survival. She remains stubbornly, gloriously, and sometimes controversially one of history's most fascinating unsolved puzzles. A queen whose myth continues to live and breathe long after her mortal coil returned to dust. As we delve deeper into Cleopatra's enduring myth, it's crucial to circle back to the geographical heart of her story, Egypt itself. With her death, the ancient land of the pharaohs underwent its most profound transformation in millennia, shifting from an independent kingdom, albeit one heavily influenced by Rome, to a direct province of the burgeoning Roman Empire. This was no mere change of overlord. It was a fundamental reorientation of Egypt's political, economic, and cultural identity. Imagine, if you will, the slow, grinding machinery of imperial bureaucracy replacing the vibrant, sometimes chaotic, court life of the Ptolemies. Octavian, now the undisputed master of the Roman world, understood the immense significance of Egypt. He treated it not as a regular senatorial province, but as his personal domain, an imperial possession. He appointed a prefect from the equestrian order, a class below senators, to govern Egypt, directly accountable to him alone. This highly unusual arrangement was designed to prevent any ambitious Roman senator from using Egypt's immense wealth and grain supply as a base for their own power, a lesson clearly learned from Antony's ambitions. It was a strategic move that concentrated immense economic power directly in Octavian's hands, solidifying his authority as the future emperor. He essentially put a velvet rope around Egypt, declaring it strictly VIP access only for himself. The immediate impact on Egypt was economic. The vast revenues from its fertile lands, particularly the annual grain harvest, were now diverted directly to Rome. This grain, critical for feeding the Roman populace, became a cornerstone of Octavian's popular support and a symbol of his ability to provide for the empire. Egypt effectively became Rome's personal breadbasket, ensuring stability and preventing food riots in the capital. While this brought a certain degree of Roman order and infrastructural development, it also meant that Egypt's immense wealth was primarily exploited for the benefit of Rome, rather than for the development of its own people or the flourishing of its unique culture. Historians still argue whether Roman rule, despite its exploitative nature, brought a period of greater stability and prosperity to the average Egyptian farmer, or simply replaced one form of foreign rule with another. The truth, as always, is likely complex. Culturally, Roman rule brought a gradual Hellenistic Romanization of Egypt. While the Romans generally respected Egyptian religious traditions, often even incorporating Egyptian deities like Isis into their own pantheon, the dominant cultural force shifted. Greek remained the language of administration and scholarship in Alexandria, but Latin gained prominence in official circles. Roman law began to overlay Egyptian customs, and Roman architectural styles gradually influenced local building. However, the ancient Egyptian traditions, particularly in religion and art, proved remarkably resilient. Temples continued to be built in the traditional Egyptian style, and the worship of local gods persisted, often alongside new Roman cults. It was a fascinating blend of cultures, sometimes harmonious, sometimes clashing, like a Roman gladiator suddenly finding himself attending a pharaonic feast. The Roman presence also meant a significant military occupation. Roman legions were permanently stationed in Egypt, not only to secure the grain supply, but also to deter any potential rebellions or external threats from the south, Nubia, or the east. This military presence ensured peace and order, but also reinforced the reality of foreign dominion. Egypt was no longer a realm of pharaohs, but a vital cog in the vast Roman imperial machine. For the ordinary Egyptian, the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the advent of Roman rule likely brought both continuity and change. The tax system remained largely in place, though now the revenue flowed to Rome. The bureaucracy continued to operate, albeit with Roman oversight. Life for the fellahin, the farmers toiling in the fertile fields, probably didn't change as dramatically as it did for the elite. Their daily routines, dictated by the ebb and flow of the Nile, largely continued, yet the sense of an independent sovereign Egypt, ruled by its own pharaohs, faded into memory, replaced by the omnipresent hand of Rome. The grand city of Alexandria, though no longer the seat of an independent kingdom, remained a vibrant center of trade and intellectual activity for centuries under Roman rule. Its port continued to be a crucial gateway for goods flowing between East and West. The Library of Alexandria, though its peak glory was behind it, still housed immense collections of scrolls and attracted scholars. But its influence as the world's preeminent research institution gradually waned as other Roman and Hellenistic cities grew in intellectual prominence. It was like a once shining star, now merely a bright constellation. Ultimately, the annexation of Egypt under Octavian, soon to be Emperor Augustus, was a strategic masterstroke that solidified the foundations of the Roman Empire. It provided stability, immense wealth, and crucial resources, enabling Rome to transition from a turbulent republic to a seemingly eternal empire. But it also marked the end of an extraordinary era, the final chapter of a powerful ancient civilization ruled by its own monarchs. Cleopatra, the last of her line, stands as the dramatic punctuation mark at the end of this long, complex sentence of Egyptian history. A queen whose personal fate became inextricably linked with the destiny of her entire nation. As we've traced Cleopatra's story from her ancestral roots in Alexander's legacy to the final, definitive annexation of Egypt by Rome, it becomes clear that her actual historical existence, while fascinating, is only one part of her enduring presence. Her most powerful legacy, perhaps, lies not in the dry facts of ancient texts, but in the vibrant, ever-evolving tapestry of her myth. It's astonishing how a figure from over 2 millennia ago can still spark debates, inspire art, and even drive modern headlines. Imagine trying to explain to the actual Cleopatra that in the future people would argue about her nose on little screens in their pockets. The core of Cleopatra's myth is a potent blend of power, beauty, and tragedy, often infused with a heavy dose of exoticism and romance. For centuries, she has been the ultimate femme fatale, the irresistible temptress who could bend mighty Roman generals to her will. This image, as we discussed, was heavily crafted by Octavian's propaganda, which needed to paint Antony's actions not as political ambition, but as a shameful surrender to foreign, effeminate corruption. This narrative, however unfair to the real Cleopatra's intelligence and political acumen, was incredibly sticky. It imprinted itself on the Western imagination, becoming the default lens through which she was viewed. Historians still argue about the true origins of the femme fatale archetype and how much Cleopatra influenced its development. Literature, as we've touched upon, played a pivotal role in solidifying this myth. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, 1607, transformed her into a character of immense psychological depth and poetic grandeur. His Cleopatra is passionate, mercurial, and ultimately chooses death over dishonor. A powerful, self-willed heroine, even if she is also defined by her relationships with men. This play's enduring popularity ensured that her story, and particularly her romance with Antony, became a staple of Western culture, shaping how countless generations imagined the queen. Think of the memorable lines, the dramatic farewells. It's all Shakespeare, brilliantly crafted, but not strictly history. Beyond Shakespeare, countless other writers, from Dryden to Shaw, continued to reinterpret her story, each adding their own layer to the myth. Her allure resonated across different eras because it touched upon timeless themes: the intoxicating power of love, the corrupting influence of ambition, the clash of East and West, and the tragic inevitability of fate. She became a canvas for exploring forbidden desires, exotic fantasies, and the ultimate price of political gambles. The visual arts, too, seized upon Cleopatra's dramatic life. From neoclassical paintings depicting her seductive encounters with Caesar and Antony, to opulent Victorian canvases showcasing her lavish lifestyle and dramatic suicide, artists found endless inspiration in her story. These works often emphasized her beauty, her dramatic costumes, and the sensual allure of ancient Egypt, further cementing her image as an exotic enchantress. The more fantastical, the better. You could almost hear the painters muttering, "Needs more gold?" and perhaps a few more exotic birds. Even archaeology and Egyptology, while aiming for scientific accuracy, sometimes inadvertently contributed to her mystique. The discovery of ancient Egyptian artifacts and tombs, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, fueled a popular fascination with all things Egyptian, and Cleopatra, as its last great independent ruler, became a central figure in this Egyptomania. The intricate hieroglyphs, the mummies, the monumental architecture all served as a backdrop against which her already dramatic story could be imagined with even greater vividness. It lent an air of ancient authenticity to a figure who was already becoming more myth than historical person. However, amidst all this artistic and popular romanticization, it's important to remember the real Cleopatra, the woman who mastered 9 languages, administered a vast kingdom, and shrewdly navigated the treacherous currents of Roman power politics. The myth often overshadows the brilliance of the true stateswoman, reducing her to a tragic lover rather than a formidable monarch. Historians still grapple with how to present a balanced view, acknowledging the compelling myth while emphasizing the complex historical figure. The challenge, and indeed the beauty, of Cleopatra's enduring myth is its adaptability. She has been transformed from a Roman boogeyman to a Shakespearean heroine, a Hollywood glamour queen, and a symbol of female defiance. Each iteration reflects the values and preoccupations of its time, proving that some stories are simply too good, too compelling, and too universally resonant to ever truly die. Her myth, perhaps more than her history, ensures that Cleopatra will continue to captivate and puzzle us for centuries to come, whispering tales of ancient power and legendary love into the night. As we journey through the layers of Cleopatra's myth, it's fascinating to consider how much of our perception of her is shaped not by direct historical evidence, but by the narratives created by others. This phenomenon is particularly acute when we examine the political and cultural lens through which she was viewed, both in her own time and throughout history. The very idea of an Eastern queen wielding immense power and influencing Roman affairs deeply unsettled the patriarchal, militaristic Roman Republic, setting the stage for a deliberate and widespread campaign of character assassination that began even before her death. Octavian, the master propagandist, understood that to defeat Antony, he first had to utterly discredit him. And the easiest way to do that was to portray him as being entirely under the sway of a foreign, decadent queen. Cleopatra became the ultimate scapegoat, the embodiment of everything Romans feared about the East: its perceived luxury, its supposed effeminacy, and its monarchical traditions that were anathema to Roman republican ideals. Roman historians and poets, eager to curry favor with the rising power of Octavian, dutifully followed suit. They painted her as a cunning temptress, a sorceress, a whore queen who used her beauty and guile to ensnare great Roman men and undermine the Republic. This wasn't merely historical reporting, it was a political weapon, wielded with devastating effectiveness. Historians still argue whether this propaganda genuinely reflected widespread Roman sentiment, or if it was primarily a top-down creation to justify Octavian's war. Probably a bit of both, given how easily fear and prejudice can be stoked. This propaganda was so pervasive and so successful that it fundamentally shaped Cleopatra's image for centuries. It's why, even today, The term femme fatale is so readily associated with her. Her intelligence, her political acumen, her multilingualism, all the qualities that made her a formidable ruler, were often downplayed or twisted into traits of manipulation and deceit. Her wealth became a sign of decadence, her charm a tool of corruption. It was a classic case of taking a powerful woman and reducing her to her perceived sexual influence. A trope that, sadly, still resonates in some corners of modern discourse. However, the historical record, when carefully examined, reveals a much more complex and pragmatic individual. Cleopatra was, first and foremost, a ruler. Her primary goal was the preservation of her kingdom and her dynasty. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony, while undoubtedly personal, were also shrewd political alliances. She understood that Egypt, wealthy as it was, could not stand alone against the might of Rome. She needed powerful Roman protectors, and she chose the most powerful men of her era. Her ability to command respect, and indeed devotion, from such figures speaks volumes about her intellect and charisma, far beyond mere physical beauty. Imagine trying to charm two of the world's most ruthless leaders into supporting your cause. It takes more than a pretty face. Moreover, Cleopatra was deeply immersed in her Egyptian identity, even though she was ethnically Greek, Macedonian. She learned the Egyptian language, participated in Egyptian religious rituals, and presented herself as a living goddess, often associated with Isis, the ancient Egyptian deity of motherhood, magic, and fertility. This was a deliberate effort to legitimize her rule in the eyes of her Egyptian subjects, many of whom had grown weary of their foreign Ptolemaic rulers. This cultural chameleonism was a mark of her sophistication and adaptability, not a sign of moral corruption. Yet, Roman propaganda dismissed this as further evidence of her Oriental nature, a sign of her abandonment of proper Greek and Roman values. The contrast between the historical Cleopatra and her mythical portrayal highlights the power of narrative. The Roman story successfully stripped her of her agency as a ruler, focusing instead on her perceived vice. It reduced a complex political alliance to a scandalous romance and a strategic defense of a kingdom to a woman's capricious desires. This simplification, while effective for propaganda, has distorted our understanding of one of history's most formidable women. Historians still argue whether such a powerful female figure could have ever escaped being demonized by the Roman patriarchal society. It's a sobering thought. Ultimately, understanding Cleopatra requires us to consciously disentangle the layers of myth from the threads of history. It means appreciating her not just as the star of a grand Roman tragedy, but as a brilliant, pragmatic, and fiercely determined queen who fought tooth and nail to preserve her ancient kingdom in a world rapidly being reshaped by the inexorable might of Rome. Her story is a testament to the enduring power of a charismatic personality, even one whose legacy was so meticulously and often unfairly rewritten by her conquerors. As we continue to dissect the many faces of Cleopatra, from historical queen to mythical enchantress, it's worth pausing to consider the sheer volume of misinformation and romanticized fantasy that has accumulated around her name. For many, the image of Cleopatra is still inextricably linked to the grand sweeping romances of Hollywood or the dramatic flourishes of classical literature, often at the expense of her true character as a shrewd, multilingual, and politically astute ruler. This distortion isn't just an academic quibble. It shapes how we understand powerful women throughout history. It's like trying to understand a complex recipe, but only focusing on the garnish. One of the most enduring myths revolves around her supposed overwhelming beauty and sexual allure as her primary tool of power. While ancient sources attest to her charm and charisma, they rarely emphasize her physical beauty in the way modern media does. Plutarch, one of our most detailed ancient biographers, states that her beauty, as we are told, was not in itself altogether incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her. Instead, he highlights her irresistible charm and the persuasiveness of her talk, along with the force of her character, which made her captivating. This suggests that her intellect, wit, and conversational prowess were far more potent than mere looks. Imagine a powerful woman who didn't rely solely on Instagram filters. This subtle but significant distinction is often lost in popular narratives, which prefer the simpler, more sensational story of a femme fatale. Historians still argue about how much of this description was a deliberate counter-narrative to Roman propaganda, and how much was genuine observation. Another persistent misconception is that she was simply a lover of Caesar and Antony, rather than a political equal or a strategic partner. This reduces her agency and diminishes her profound role in the events of the late Roman Republic. Her relationships with these powerful Roman generals were not just personal. They were deeply interwoven with her geopolitical strategy to preserve the Ptolemaic dynasty and secure Egypt's position in a rapidly changing world. She didn't merely fall in love. She formed alliances that were critical to her survival. She used her unique position, her wealth, and her personal charisma to navigate a world dominated by Roman might, ensuring that Egypt remained nominally independent for as long as possible. Consider the notion that she sought to become Empress of Rome. While Roman propaganda certainly pushed this narrative to demonize her, it's highly unlikely that Cleopatra or even Antony truly envisioned moving the capital to Alexandria and turning Rome into a mere province of an Eastern empire. Roman society was deeply xenophobic and vehemently anti-monarchical. Any such overt attempt would have immediately triggered a massive Roman backlash. Her ambitions were likely more pragmatic: to establish a powerful, independent Hellenistic kingdom that could coexist with Rome, perhaps even as a dominant power in the East. She dreamed of a new Hellenistic empire, not necessarily conquering Rome, but certainly balancing its power. Then there's the romantic notion of her being purely Egyptian. While she adopted Egyptian customs, learned the language, and presented herself as a pharaoh and a living goddess, she was ethnically Macedonian Greek, a descendant of Ptolemy the First Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals. Her native language was Koine Greek, the lingua franca of the Hellenistic world. This blend of Greek and Egyptian identity is crucial to understanding her, representing the fusion that characterized the Ptolemaic dynasty itself. To simplify her as merely Egyptian is to ignore a significant part of her heritage and the complex cultural tapestry of her reign. It's like calling a New Yorker purely American without acknowledging their multi-generational immigrant background. The fascination with Cleopatra also tends to overlook the profound economic and strategic realities of her time. Egypt was not just a romantic backdrop for dramatic love affairs. It was a geopolitical prize, a staggeringly wealthy nation whose grain supply was essential for feeding the Roman populace. Her battles and alliances were not just personal dramas. They were high-stakes geopolitical maneuvers over vast resources and regional dominance. The stakes were immensely high, and her choices had continent-spanning consequences. Ultimately, by critically examining the layers of myth, we gain a deeper appreciation for the historical Cleopatra, a formidable ruler who fought valiantly to maintain her power and the independence of her kingdom in the face of an unstoppable Roman tide. She was a woman of immense intelligence, ambition, and resilience, who dared to challenge the most powerful men of her age. Her story is not just a tragic romance. It is a testament to extraordinary leadership and a reminder that history is often far more complex and far more interesting than the simplistic narratives we sometimes prefer. We've journeyed through the triumphs and tragedies of Cleopatra, navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics, and peeled back the layers of myth that have accrued around her name. Now, as our bedtime history draws to a close, let's take a final moment to reflect on the woman herself, the lasting echoes of her choices, and the profound impact she had on the ancient world and on our imagination. Imagine the whispers of the wind sweeping across the sands of Egypt, carrying her story through the centuries, sometimes clear, sometimes distorted. Cleopatra was, without a doubt, a force of nature. Born into a dynasty teetering on the brink of collapse, she inherited not a stable kingdom, but a viper's nest of familial intrigue and crippling debt. Yet, against all odds, she managed to not only reclaim her throne multiple times, but also to sustain Egypt's independence for nearly 2 decades in the face of an ever-expanding Roman Republic. This wasn't merely luck. It was a testament to her extraordinary intelligence, her diplomatic prowess, and her unshakable will to survive. Historians still argue whether her reign merely prolonged the inevitable or if she truly held the potential to carve out a lasting, independent empire in the East. Perhaps she did, if only fate had been kinder, or Roman ambition less insatiable. Her greatest strength lay in her adaptability and her ability to connect with diverse peoples. She wasn't just a Greek queen, she was a pharaoh who embraced Egyptian culture, spoke its language, and presented herself as a living deity. This allowed her to command the loyalty of her subjects in a way few of her Ptolemaic predecessors could. And then, there was her uncanny ability to charm and influence the most powerful men of her age, Julius Caesar and Marc Antony. This wasn't just about beauty, as we've discussed. It was about engaging them on an intellectual and strategic level, becoming indispensable partners in their ambitions. She was a master of statecraft, playing a high-stakes game of international diplomacy with a skill rarely seen in any era, let alone from a young woman in the ancient world. You could say she was truly a polyglot politician, with a knack for making powerful friends. Yet her story is also a profound tragedy. For all her genius and determination, she ultimately could not defy the relentless march of Roman expansion. She gambled everything on her alliances with Caesar and Antony, tying her fate inextricably to theirs. When Caesar fell to an assassin's dagger, and Antony succumbed to Octavian's calculated ruthlessness, Cleopatra's world, and with it, independent Egypt, crumbled. Her final defiant act of suicide, designed to deny Octavian his ultimate triumph, cemented her image as a proud, unconquerable queen. But it also marked the end of a glorious, millennia-long chapter of Egyptian history. It's a stark reminder that even the most formidable individuals can be overwhelmed by larger historical forces. Her children, caught in the devastating aftermath of their parents' choices, bore the brunt of Rome's cold pragmatism. Caesarion, the little Caesar, was executed to eliminate any rival claim to Caesar's legacy. Her children with Antony, though spared their lives, became symbols of Roman victory, paraded through the streets of Rome before being absorbed into the Roman aristocratic sphere. Their fates were a poignant illustration of the brutal price of imperial conquest and the finality of Rome's triumph. Cleopatra's legacy, therefore, is a complex tapestry woven from historical fact, political propaganda, and artistic reimagining. She remains a compelling figure precisely because she embodies so many timeless dichotomies: power versus vulnerability, love versus ambition, East versus West, defiance versus defeat. She challenges us to look beyond simplistic narratives and to appreciate the multifaceted nature of human experience and the powerful forces that shape history. Her myth, continuously reshaped by each generation, speaks to our own fascinations, our enduring interest in powerful women, forbidden romances, and the allure of ancient civilizations. Whether she is seen as a tragic lover, a calculating politician, or a symbol of enduring female strength, Cleopatra continues to command our attention, a testament to a life lived on an epic scale. As the sun sets on our historical journey and the stars begin to twinkle, remember Cleopatra not just as a queen, but as a woman who, against overwhelming odds, dared to dream of an empire whose brilliance shone brightly and whose story continues to whisper through the ages. And so, the epic tale of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, gently comes to its rest. Feel the weight of history settle softly around you, like the ancient sands drifting over forgotten monuments. Her story, a river flowing through time, has carried us through grand palaces and desperate battles, through whispers of love and shouts of betrayal, leaving ripples across millennia. Imagine the soft glow of the Alexandrian lighthouse, now a distant memory, guiding ships to a port that once pulsed with her vibrant presence. Her voice, speaking many tongues, now blends into the quiet hum of the universe. The echoes of her laughter, her commands, her final defiant breath, all fade into the tranquil stillness of the past. As the long night deepens, let the fascinating enigma of this queen, a woman who dared to stand against the tide of history, settle into the quiet corners of your mind. Her dreams, her struggles, her extraordinary life, now part of the deep, comforting tapestry of time itself. Close your eyes and drift into the peaceful slumber that follows the greatest stories.